armed submarines based in Scotland, and would much rather that investment was devoted towards more conventional defence forces and other jobs and needs in Scotland.
Thank you. We will now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 9355 in the name of Kevin Stewart on the Scottish Government's third national planning framework and review of Scottish planning policy. Members who wish to speak in this debate should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Kevin Stewart to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. Mr Stewart, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I begin by moving the motion in my name. I am pleased to open this debate on behalf of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee on the Scottish Government's proposed third national planning framework for Scotland. I would like to start by thanking all of those witnesses who gave evidence to the committee on the proposed framework. I would also like to thank my colleagues in the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee and the Rural Affairs and Climate Change and Environment Committee for the coordinated approach they adopted with us as the lead committee in scrutinising the framework. This level of cooperation in an area of shared interest shows the Parliament's committee system at its best. Land use planning is one of the most important policy functions that government at both a local and a national level undertakes. This is because planning is integral to the success of so many other policy areas, such as community planning, regeneration policy, sustainable economic development, energy generation, transport, housing and mitigating the impacts of climate change, to name just a few. Importantly, the National Planning Framework also sets out those developments which the Scottish Government has identified as being of national level importance to the economic, social, physical and spatial development of Scottish society. I know my fellow conveners taking part in this debate will speak further on many of these issues as they have examined them as part of their own committee scrutiny of the framework. While it will be for our respective successor committees in the next session of the Parliament to consider how they will approach their scrutiny of the successor to this proposed framework, I commend the approach we and our fellow committees have taken on this occasion. For our part, Presiding Officer, the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, as the lead committee with responsibility for scrutinising planning policy, decided to focus our scrutiny on the draft framework on its strategic connections to other key policy areas, such as the National Performance Framework, community-led regeneration and the community planning system. We also considered the consultation process the Scottish Government undertook as part of the development of this framework, as well as the role played by the Parliament and its committees in terms of developing planning policy. Our report on the framework considers issues such as how to improve the public's understanding of and engagement with planning policy and the planning system. We also took this opportunity to examine the Scottish Government's ongoing review of Scottish planning policy, which is a key part of the planning system in Scotland. As the Minister for Local Government and Planning has told us on more than one occasion, the National Planning Framework sets out where we wish to see development take place in Scotland, and the Scottish planning policy sets out how we wish to see that development take place. Therefore, these two key documents form the cornerstone of our modern planning system. We commend the Minister for deciding to review both of these key policy documents in tandem with each other. The current legal framework for our planning system is based on the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997. This was in turn supplemented and updated by the Planning Etc. Scotland Act 2006, which, amongst other things, placed the National Planning Framework on a statutory footing. In our report, we state that land use planning and development is by its very nature complex, contentious and laden with real or perceived contradictions. It is one of the few areas of national policy in which almost everyone in society will hold some sort of opinion. Planning is one of the clearest examples of where the often opaque and impersonal process of making difficult decisions for the needs of society at large comes face to face with people's everyday individual and family lives and the places where they live. That is why it matters that we get the planning system right. I'd like to turn now to some of the specifics of our report, we went into some depth. Several witnesses we heard from commented on the 60-day statutory period by which the Parliament must consider the proposed framework. All of the groups we heard from agreed there is value to be added by the Parliament, giving greater consideration to the principles which underpin the development of the framework and the criteria by which government decides which national developments should be set out in it. We welcome the detailed consultation the Scottish Government has undertaken in developing the framework and the focus of delivering a plan-led system for Scottish planning, and there was quite a lot of praise for that detailed consultation. As a committee, we recommend the development of the next planning framework should begin with this Parliament considering the principles and criteria upon which it should be based. This includes debating the types of national developments the framework may contain. This process should precede any public consultation by government on a future framework. That's spelled out in paragraphs 55 and 83 of our report. The National Planning Framework and the Scottish Planning Policy are complementary documents. We believe the Government should adopt as standard practice a review of Scottish planning policy in parallel with the development of future frameworks. We also recommend the Government consider working towards merging the framework and the Scottish planning policy as far as practical into a single national plan. One issue which was drawn to our attention was the need for a spatial framework to reflect how Scotland connects to Europe and the wider world. We recommend the finalised third national planning framework reflect the international aspect of spatial connectivity, as well as recognise Scotland's planning system within a wider European context. Presiding Officer, as a committee, we were concerned to learn that only a few of Scotland's 32 local authorities currently have up-to-date local development plans, despite the fact that this is a statutory duty. We are supportive of the Scottish Government's continuing efforts to rectify this situation and look forward to the results of the review which is currently underway.
I need to ask you to wind up,
Presiding
Mr.
Officer, there are many more aspects of this which I'm sure colleagues will go into, and I thank the opportunity to discuss this today. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Murdo Fraser to speak to on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Mr Fraser, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to contribute to this debate and speak in support of the motion in Kevin Stewart's name on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, and my remarks come with the usual caveat that they represent the views of the committee and are not necessarily my own. The committee welcomed the new approach of aligning scrutiny of both the National Planning Framework and review of Scottish planning policy, and we focused our scrutiny on a number of key energy issues which were addressed in both documents. And I want to concentrate my remarks today on two key areas. Firstly, the siting of onshore wind farms, and secondly, proposals for onshore unconventional gas extraction. And before commenting on the substance of the committee's report, I'd like to place on record my thanks to all those who gave evidence to the committee, to my fellow committee members, to our committee clerks, and to the SPICE researchers who assisted us. To deal firstly with the question of onshore wind farms, the committee considered the Scottish Government's proposal that the updated core areas of wild land map be used by planners when determining areas where onshore wind farms can be located, and also the proposal to increase the buffer zone between wind farms and communities from 2 to 2.5 kilometres. Now, it's clear from the evidence we received that there is overwhelming support for the principle of protection of areas of wild land in Scotland. But what planners, developers and communities want is clarity on how that can be achieved. And what was less clear, however, is whether the map in its current form can achieve that. There were some concerns raised about the methodology used to create the map, described by the Minister as a desk exercise informed by GIS data. If development is not to be permitted in areas identified as wild land, there is a concern about how this might impact on surrounding areas and whether the intention is for planners to take this into account when considering onshore wind farm applications. Now, a further consultation on the map was undertaken towards the end of last year, and as the analysis had not been concluded during evidence-taking, the Minister was unable to give the committee the government's final policy position. The committee is of the view that for the planning system to be effective, it needs to be transparent and policy needs to be applied consistently. And we therefore recommended in our report that the Scottish Government state clearly in the final planning documents its policy position on the protection of wild land and provide clarity on the various issues raised in evidence. And given the level of interest in this matter, I hope the Minister would take the opportunity today to provide some clarity. The second aspect we looked at was the proposal to increase the separation distance between onshore wind farms and communities from 2 to 2.5 kilometres. Now, we heard different evidence about this. Unsurprisingly, the energy sector wished to retain the existing separation, whilst those, including conservation groups who were opposed to greater onshore wind development, wished to see the distance increased. But where both sides agreed was that there was some confusion as to how the policy would be applied, given that the planning documents do not contain definitions either of a wind farm or of a community. And there was some confusion about whether a planning authority would retain any flexibility in siting onshore wind farms, and would, for example, they still be able to take the views of local communities into account when considering applications. So in our report, we recommended that the final planning documents provide clarity on how these terms, wind farm and community, are to be interpreted, and whether the separation distance be a fixed boundary or not. When the Minister gave evidence to us, he took the opportunity to explain that he had thought that setting a fixed boundary would provide greater certainty, but acknowledged it had not done so. He pointed out that the current proposal did not take account of the individual characteristics of landscapes and local circumstances, and therefore he was considering the evidence before coming to a final view. Now, while we as a committee appreciate the Minister reflecting on the evidence, it would be helpful if he could clarify today the Scottish Government's final policy position on how the separation distance is to be applied. The second key area for the committee was in the Scottish Government's proposal in the main issues report to consolidate and develop emerging opportunities to utilise onshore reserves of unconventional gas. As members will be aware, this is perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of Scottish planning policy. It's a new area for developers, for planners and communities. Now, what became clear to the committee during evidence-taking was that there was a lack of information available, leading to a lack of understanding about the planning process, required levels of consultation and possible environmental impacts. Given the number of agencies involved in the licensing and monitoring of both unconventional gas extraction and hydraulic fracturing, the committee recommended that the final planning document should outline the different roles and responsibilities of the various agencies involved. And in particular, we asked the Minister to consider whether the application processes for unconventional gas extraction and the use of hydraulic fracturing fully involved the communities where the extraction could take place, and we recommended that both processes should be subject to the same level of community consultation. The issue of whether there should be a buffer zone between extraction sites and communities, and if so the distance, is yet another area where the Scottish Government's final position remains unknown. It is an issue which divided the committee, with the majority at this stage agreeing not to set a fixed separation distance. I understand that the Government's expert scientific panel is currently considering the buffer zone proposal. Unfortunately, the Minister was unable to confirm to the committee when the panel would report or when he would make a final decision on this key issue. The lack of a clear policy position on a number of key energy issues was not only disappointing, but it is also detrimental to the ability of the committee and stakeholders to fully scrutinise proposed changes to planning policy. The committee concluded, therefore, that all consultative and research work should be concluded prior to any future draft national planning framework being laid and the 60-day scrutiny period commencing. Presiding Officer, I've raised a number of key concerns that were identified in the committee's report. I hope the Minister will this afternoon take the opportunity to respond to some of these, because the committee members were all agreed that it is important that we do have greater clarity on these very important matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Maureen Watt to speak on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. 6 minutes, please, or thereby.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I also welcome the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the proposed National Planning Framework 3, this time on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. I would also like to thank those who provided written and oral evidence to the committee, and I would like to thank my fellow committee members for their input. The committee welcomes the Scottish Government's ambition to make Scotland a more successful country and recognises the role that the NPF has to play in achieving this. The national developments outlined in the NPF 3 document will spearhead progress in regeneration, energy, environment, transport, housing and digital connectivity. I'd like to start with some general comments on the NPF 3 processes and document some of the concerns mentioned. Stakeholders have raised questions about the timescale for scrutiny of NPF planning framework documents. I won't labour the point, but for a document of such significance, the timescales allowed present a serious challenge for both stakeholders and committees to consider the NPF 3 in the depth it deserves. This is especially true where multiple documents are being considered in tandem, as NPF and the Scottish planning policy have been on this occasion. It is a welcome and sensible step that the scrutiny of these documents has been coordinated, given the linkages between them. The committee heard that stakeholders would welcome an extension of this approach to include other key documents which form the strategic planning and investment framework in Scotland, such as the National Transport Strategy, Second Report on Proposals and Policies, RPP2, and the Infrastructure Investment Plan. Indeed, the IPP was itself the subject of an update and progress report announced yesterday. Would it not have been better for committees to have had access to this document to help inform their consideration of the draft NPF3? The committee was of the view that there would be value in the government making clear the hierarchy of documents which form this framework, the role each of these documents play and how they impact upon one another in the finalised NPF3 or associated documentation. This approach may clarify why certain projects have been allocated national development status where others were not. In some cases, this may be because they were covered by another document elsewhere in the hierarchy. Better signposting of information forming the background to the NPF3 was something the committee felt would benefit the finalised document. Although the scoring for the projects proposed for national development status is available on the Scottish Government's website, there is no mention in the NPF3 document of where the information can be accessed. The committee took the view that highlighting where this information can be accessed would improve transparency. Also, in the interests of transparency, the committee recommended that the finalised NPF3 and future NPF documents provide information regarding the progress and outcomes of national development projects, which are included in one iteration of NPF but do not appear in the following iteration. This may also assist in achieving better outcome measurement. I'd now like to turn specifically to areas of transport, housing, digital infrastructure. Strategic airport enhancements were an area of some debate in evidence. The potential economic benefit they may bring forward was discussed, but we also heard concerns about how projected growth of air travel to Scotland might impact upon emissions targets. The committee welcomed the potential for economic growth from these enhancements, but urged caution, mindful of the scale of the emissions targets still to be met. There was greater consensus regarding the importance of surface access systems. In evidence, it was suggested that improved surface access and better connection between transport systems may reduce the need for domestic flights and, as such, help emission targets. On rail developments, the committee heard concerns that the high-speed rail link from Edinburgh to Glasgow had been allocated national development status when the business case had not yet been produced. However, we understand that this is due shortly and look forward to receiving the details from the Transport Minister. The issue of rail freight was raised by stakeholders, specifically why rail freight was not included as a national development, where there are 3 seaport projects listed as national developments. The committee recommended that in future iterations of the NPF rail freight rail freight should be seriously considered for national development status. The Scottish Government has already acknowledged the importance of rail freight for Scotland's future in the NPF3, and the committee has highlighted its potential to make a very real contribution towards meeting wider objectives in relation to enhanced connectivity and sustainability. On active travel matters, the committee was pleased to note the inclusion of the National Long-Distance Cycling and Network in NPF3 and the Government's plans to include the creation of active towns. In its consideration of housing issues in the NPF document, the committee also found common ground with other committees, namely in its concern at evidence which suggests that the majority of local authority development plans were over 5 years old, contrary to legislative requirements. I would lend the ICC's support to these concerns and urge the Scottish Government to work with local authorities to ensure speedy resolution of this matter. We noted that broadband fibre network was rolling out on time, and we look forward to seeing that it is future-proofed. To conclude, I hope the Infrastructures Committee's recommendations are of some use to the Scottish Government in strengthening the document and making it clear and transparent, a clear and transparent plan for Scotland's future. We look forward to hearing the Minister's response.
Many thanks. I now call on Rob Gibson to speak on behalf of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Mr Gibson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be here speaking on behalf of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee in this debate on the Scottish Government's proposed National Planning Framework 3. At this point, I was encouraged to quote from Winston Churchill, but indeed I'm going to quote from the Planning Minister who came to our committee, and he said, "The planning system is sometimes about conflict and about balancing interests. It is a question of balancing the needs of the country and the needs of the local environment." I think these sum up very well what we considered at the moment. I think this effectively summarises the belief of our committee that in order to reduce our carbon emissions, adapt to changes in our climate and have a sustainable rural Scotland, we need to ensure appropriate plans are in place now. The committee believes that the proposed NPF 3 has a fundamental role in delivering Scotland's greenhouse gas reduction targets, in helping our environment and communities to adapt to climate change and ensuring that the sustainability of rural Scotland. We agree with the evidence that we heard from stakeholders that the NPF 3 is indeed a positive and ambitious document, and we welcome the emphasis it places on delivering low-carbon Scotland and on meeting our climate change targets. The committee also heard from stakeholders that the proposed NPF 3 could be strengthened in places, and this afternoon I'll focus my comments on just some of these, mainly in relation to the ways in which we can meet our low-carbon targets and for the protection and restoration of our peatlands. As the Minister for Local Government and Planning will have seen from our report, we're calling for the tools we already have at our disposal to be used to improve our decision-making processes for the benefit of the future at all levels of government. We heard from SEPA on the Spatial Planning Assessment of Climate Emissions tool, which is called SPACE, helpfully, which was applied in the Strategic Environmental Assessments for National Developments in the NPF 3. The SPACE tool can be used to estimate the likely carbon emissions relating to building energy use, transport energy use, waste and land use changes, and also enables the impact of carbon emissions of different development scenarios to be assessed. The committee recommends in its report that carbon assessments are carried out for all developments, as it believes doing this will help us in responding to the challenging targets of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 and in the RPP2. We ask that a requirement for carbon assessments for all developments is reflected in the final NPF 3. On a similar point, the committee heard of how the carbon calculator tool is used to assess the impact of wind farm developments. It compares the carbon cost of building the wind farm with the carbon savings attributable to its running. The calculations summarised as the length of time in years or months maybe it will take for the carbon savings to amount to a carbon costs, and this is referred to as the payback period. So the payback period is vitally important for us to know the value of such proposals. Currently, this carbon calculation is only required for wind farm developments with a capacity of 50 megawatts or above. The committee recommends that in its report that carbon impact of every aspect of a wind farm, including the impact of importation, transportation and carbon payback period, be assessed for all wind farms, no matter what their size. As most of you will know, our peatlands also provide a significant contribution to carbon abatement and the meeting of our carbon emissions reduction targets. While we welcome the commitment in the NPF 3 towards the restoration of peatlands, we believe that their protection is equally important. Scottish Environment Link told us, quotes, that it's important not to single out wind farms. Developments in other sectors cause damage to peatlands if they are in the wrong place, whether they are housing developments, supermarkets or open-cast mines. The carbon balance of a coal mine is slightly different from the carbon balance of an onshore wind farm. That's why we support the call for all stakeholders to require carbon assessments to be carried out for all developments on peatlands, irrespective of what they are for, and we made a recommendation for this in our report. Presiding Officer, the committee also recommends that the detailed information gathered on peat condition and depth that is gathered by potential private developers and submitted as part of the planning process is used to assist our understanding of peat. We welcome the recognition from the Minister for Environment and Climate Change that the detailed environmental assessments carried out by these private developers provides a useful opportunity for us to capture very detailed information. As a committee, we look forward to hearing during our future consideration of peatlands just how this will be encouraged and used by the Scottish Government, SNH and other stakeholders to inform their knowledge and decisions. Some of the stakeholders raised a concern that the proposed NPF 3 specifically refers to the restoration of peatlands in the north and north-west of Scotland, and they, like the committee, are keen to ensure that the relevance of peatlands anywhere in Scotland is recognised. We were glad to have the reassurance from the Minister for Environment and Climate Change that the Scottish Government's commitment to peatland restoration applies not only to the north and north-west of the country, but also to peatlands across the whole of Scotland. In conclusion, the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee welcomes the proposed NPF 3 and has suggested ways in which the final document could be strengthened in relation to climate change and environmental matters. I am pleased to support the motion in the name of Kevin Stewart and look forward to the Minister's response.
Many thanks. And we now call on the Minister, Derek Mackay. 12 minutes or thereby, Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is perhaps appropriate that the date chosen to announce the preparation of Scotland's third National Planning Framework and a review of Scottish planning policy was 18th of September 2012. I have no doubt that this date in 2014 will in future be remembered not as the day where I launched that planning announcement, but as the day that Scotland took over control of its own destiny. The enormity of that decision will inevitably overshadow the importance of that announcement in 2012. But the decision to review these two crucial planning documents simultaneously for the first time was important. Make no mistake, although not quite as historic as a decision on Scotland's future, NPF 3 and SPP are both important documents that will play a key role in shaping that future. NPF 3 is a spatial expression of the Government's economic strategy. It is about our ambition to create great places that support sustainable economic growth across the country, realising our opportunities for development and investment. It brings together our plans and strategies to provide a coherent vision for how Scotland as a place should evolve over the next 20 to 30 years. The debate in Parliament on the Main Issues report last March supported our key themes and our vision of Scotland as a successful, sustainable place, a low-carbon place, a natural, resilient place and a connected place. The revised SPP also supports this vision. It sets out our national priorities to guide future development and decisions so that the planning system delivers better places for people to visit, to live, to work in and to invest. My decision to review both documents together for the first time was no accident. This integrated approach to considering the questions of where development should take place, together with how the planning system should operate, has given people and indeed Parliament the opportunity to consider and debate Scotland's planning overall role and contribution to Scotland's future. Parliamentary scrutiny is the final stage of an open and transparent engagement process that has taken place through the preparation of NPF 3 and SPP. The contributions have been invaluable, and I am particularly grateful to the 4 committees that took evidence on the documents. Many issues were raised in the committees that will be highlighted today. The Local Government and Regeneration Committee focused on the overall role of NPF 3 and its relationship with SPP and other Scottish Government policies. Their report emphasises the importance of planning making the links between those policies so that they work better together to create more successful, sustainable places. The Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee has discussed transport, housing, water infrastructure and suite of national developments. The committee highlights the need to continually review and develop the relationship between planning and our investment in infrastructure to support growth, regeneration and investment. The Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee has naturally focused on energy matters and covered issues relevant to both NPF 3 and SPP. There are many different views on the role of MPF3 in making Scotland a low-carbon place. We've covered some of it today. I believe the balanced nature of this committee's scrutiny has moved us some way towards consensus on a number of challenging issues, including onshore wind and unconventional gas. And the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee has provided wide-ranging discussions on the role of MPF3 in creating a sustainable rural Scotland and supporting the climate change agenda. I recognise the importance of these in underpinning the strategy and ensuring that MPF3 and the SPP support economic growth that is truly sustainable. I've been asked by, of course,
Alex Ferguson.
The importance of rural Scotland, and I know at least 2 committees considered the issue of wild land. Both in the NPF2 and the Main Issues Report recognise the need for strong protection for our wildest landscapes, and I think it would be fair to say there was an expectation amongst many stakeholders that this would be recognised by the inclusion of SNH's wildland map in NPF3. By not including this, has the Government changed its mind on that importance?
Minister.
No, we haven't changed our mind. What I'm looking forward to is the full analysis of the SNH consultation so that can then inform Scottish planning policy, SPP, which is a more appropriate place to locate those decisions around grouping and the relevance of wild lands. An important point, of course, it's not a new designation that we proposed. It was specifically in relation to wind turbines. That's still under active consideration on the evidence-based approach. The methodology I said I would use is still under consideration. To come back to Murdo Fraser's points, there are still matters I have to get further evidence and advice on before I conclude government policy. I think it's better that I engage, consult, listen to the views of Parliament today before concluding that finalised government position, rather than the other way about, take a finalised government position and then ignore Parliament. So specifically, we will come back to that. Specifically, no, we've not changed our mind, but I'm taking further evidence to ensure that the mapping exercise is robust and will sufficiently address the issues that I intended to do in terms of onshore wind, which was to support the continuation of meeting our targets, but also greater protection for the environment and to get that balance right.
Jim Hume.
The Minister for taking an intervention. Just pursuing the matter regarding wild land, the Minister said that they would want to consult further, but does the Minister recognise that the consultation that has happened, there was 73% of respondents supporting wild land being mapped?
Minister.
I recognise there's a polarised opinion in terms of the renewables approach. It will be my intention to get the balance right between a continuation of a renewables strategy for Scotland that meets the most ambitious climate change targets in the world, but also give greater protection to the environment where that's appropriate. And hopefully we'll get the balance right, and I'll look very closely at the research that's been provided on that subject. In relation to 1 or 2 other matters that Murdo Fraser raised, I hope to be able to return to some of these in the summing up, but in some areas such as the buffer zone and the expert panel and unconventional gas, we will require to take further time before we reach a finalised position. But I'm sure in the true nature of consultation in Parliament, that's what any member would expect. Each of the committees has agreed on a number of recommendations, which I know will be discussed in this debate. Their interest in this and the quality of the discussions confirms the important relationship between MPF3 and this Government's purpose. I welcome the rigour with which Parliament has considered MPF3 and the review of SPP. In return, I can assure members that we will carefully consider their recommendations. To set the scene for this debate, I will highlight a number of key issues that have been discussed across the 4 committees. Firstly, there were questions about the information used to inform decisions on the content of proposed MPF3. This is unsurprising, although the document itself is succinct. Its content is based on 2 years of information gathering and analysis, indeed with the launch in September 2012. Much of this information is lengthy and complex, but we've made the process as transparent as possible by making background material available at each stage of the process. This includes all of the accompanying assessments and detailed analysis of candidates for national development status. The proposed MPF3 includes 14 national developments that will deliver the aims of the National Spatial Strategy. Many members have discussed national developments, including those we have included and those that we have not. There was also considerable interest in how we have narrowed down 242 formal proposals to 14 proposed national developments. It is inevitable that many people want to see their proposals given national development status. I believe the developments we have proposed provide the best possible articulation of our overall spatial strategy. They also strike a positive balance between ambition and pragmatic delivery. and I welcome the consensus that appears to have emerged in the committee debates on the 14 national developments in these proposals. The third common issue is the way in which MPF3 relates to other Scottish Government plans, programmes and strategies. MPF3 has been informed at every stage by existing and emerging policy. I believe that the MPF plays a unique and valuable role in setting out what our policies mean for Scotland as a place. I hope you agree that the MPF's role is to bring together, not duplicate these policies, and that it must focus specifically on those issues which have a clear spatial dimension and benefit from this status. And finally, the spatial coverage of strategy has clearly been uppermost in many members' minds. This is a strategy for all of Scotland, setting out nationally important themes, but also shows how these themes will play out differently in our cities, towns, villages and countryside. Of course, some parts of Scotland can expect large-scale development, while smaller-scale, locally-led change will emerge in other places. But I am confident that this strategy is relevant to all parts of Scotland. The planning system is not often accused of being ahead of the game, but a yes vote on the 18th of September will finally enable Scotland to take advantage of its devolved land use planning system. MPF3 and SPP, both these documents will make a significant contribution to this Government's agenda and ambitions to make Scotland a more successful country, to support sustainable economic growth and to move to a low-carbon economy. Many of these decisions that are central to these ambitions will be guided by the planning system. Decisions about supporting the development needs of our growth sectors, investment decisions to ensure transport, housing, energy and digital infrastructure meets the needs of our people, and decisions about how best to protect and value the many physical assets, both natural and cultural, that make Scotland such a special place. Some of these decisions will be widely supported and others will inevitably generate conflicting views. That is why a planning system that provides clarity and confidence to developers and communities is so vitally important to Scotland. Together, MPF3 and SPP will provide a clear national vision of what is expected of the planning system and the outcomes that it must deliver for the people of Scotland. I welcome again the consensus around the national developments, the ongoing support for MPF3. I will deliver on the clarity and the requests for clarity and the potential around these proposals. I do believe that there is better process that can be delivered. We've learned again from NPF2 and MPF3 in the next iteration. I think process can be enhanced with many of the suggestions that the committees have made. And I think that we have also benefited from simultaneously reviewing MPF3 and Scottish planning policy, giving SPP the kind of parliamentary exposure that I think it deserves. And I will listen to the recommendations specifically from the committees and respond in due course. Of course, the implementation date for this is June 2014. Of course, the 60-day period that members have referred to was set by the Planning Act, set by a previous Parliament, and it would be wrong to suggest that this process has only taken 60 days. Of course, there was a big run-in in terms of the whole MPF3 process, but this 60-day parliamentary scrutiny period is invaluable, and we'll consider how we can enhance that, taking on board the recommendations from the committees. So too, to make sure that we are able to deliver, there is an action plan, monitoring arrangements and a wider planning action plan. We're working with all the stakeholders to ensure that planning delivers, also capturing the concerns raised about LDPs and the fact that so many are behind and out of date. But this is about policy principles, and this is about a plan, a vision, ambitions for Scotland and giving clarity. And I hope that as we move to the end of this process with the consensus we've reached, that we can deliver that for Scotland to deliver sustainable economic growth, and I look forward to the remainder of this debate. Thank you very much.
And thank you. I now call on Sarah Byatt. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm going to ignore the beginning and some of the end of the Planning Minister's speech, because I think it was a kind of one-size-fits-all speech for every occasion that he has to speak at. And I really want to focus on the core comments about NPF3 and the SPP. And in the time available, there's 3 key areas that I really want to reflect on. I want to reflect on the process and timing issues, the issues which haven't been given sufficient weighting or are omitted in the final document, and then areas where it's absolutely clear from looking at the recommendations from committees that more work is required. And I think there's been a common theme from the committees that the process has not been good enough this time around, and some very sensible suggestions made which would improve the quality of the scrutiny and transparency of the process, but would also improve the outcomes of the document. And I think there's been a substantial amount of work carried out by the parliamentary committees, and a significant effort to enable witnesses and consultees have been able to contribute to the process. But it's absolutely clear from the recommendations of those committees that the process and the work carried out by the Scottish Government to date has not been sufficiently robust, and that it hasn't been completed. And there are far too many loose ends for this stage in the process. Now, in terms of parliamentary scrutiny, I would want to raise the concern that the 4 committees, having completed a great deal of work, having published their recommendations and conclusions on Friday, and for our debate today, I just don't believe there's been enough time for MSPs to consider those recommendations and to actually reflect on the recommendations that they have each made. And I think part of the test is to join up the dots between those committees. And it's not just about our capacity to respond to the debate as MSPs, it's also the fact that we're having a debate where the Minister and his civil servants haven't had much time to consider them too. We're having a debate when the Minister has seen those recommendations on Friday, presuming he's been tied to his desk and looking at his computer, and his civil servants likewise, and the capacity to just stand back and process and reflect on those issues, I actually think is incredibly short, given that we've only had Friday and then Monday to actually do that. So I think the detail has got to be right, but the high-level thinking has got to be right too, and it's got to cut right across government in the way that each of our parliamentary committees have done their job of evaluating NPF3 and SPP from their policy perspective and from their responsibility. Now, a key weakness, I think, identified across the committees that we need to reflect on is a lack of coordination to ensure that the key issues are analysed and consulted on effectively. I thought the Local Government and Regeneration Committee recommendation that there's a need for a more coordinated and effective consultation process was right. I think the Infrastructure Committee comments about the problems of the timescale for the consultation for the NPF for consultees was correct as well. And the request for clarity from the Scottish Government on the progress of the implementation of projects identified in previous NPFs was a reasonable one, which I hope the Planning Minister will reflect on and will agree to. Now, one of the main objectives of the NPF process is to enable identification of the nationally significant projects which are not short-term projects and which will be followed up by government agencies in terms of investment priorities, which also give the private sector interest a clear steer of the priorities for the next 2 to 3 decades. And that means that the inclusion of projects needs to be transparent and that there's clarity on the criteria used to select projects. And that's important for the winners so that people understand why they are key priorities, but it's also important to understand why certain projects have not been selected. And that then leaves a challenge at the regional and local level as to how they might be taken forward. Now, there were a number of key issues that were not given sufficient weighting or were actually omitted in the final document, and I've had representations from a variety of interests who simply can't see what's happened to things, whether or not they agreed with them. I think the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee has rightly highlighted what is effectively a confusion about the lack of clarity on the importance of sustainable development, which should be on the face of the NPF and the SPP, because it provides the context both for the where and the how of the planning system. And the committee has also highlighted the lack of connection to the RPP, and I think this has to be a significant omission, because surely this is the fundamental issue given the government's climate change commitments, because this NPF3 is probably the most important national document which sets the frame, it sets the route map for investment decisions over the next 30 years, which is the time when we've got to get it right on climate change. So it needs to bring everything together, and I think it's clear from the recommendations of the committees that there's more work that needs to be done to there if we're all going to get the carbon world, the low carbon world that we all aspire to. I finally want to conclude on the areas where more work is required to strengthen the document that's been highlighted across the committees. And I think it's worrying that there are several big-ticket issues where there's clearly more work required before these documents can be approved. Our airports have been mentioned. They're crucial to our future development, but the issues about a low-carbon transport strategy need to be embedded in terms of a credible plan for accessible transport to Glasgow Airport. We're promised something soon, but not in time for us to scrutinise these proposals. The coverage of energy, I think, also leaves many, many questions unanswered. So I go back to the initial concerns I highlighted. There are simply too many areas where organisations and consultees have rightly asked questions about the lack of robustness in some of the proposals and policies we are discussing today. And I do think the Minister has overstated the consensus that's been achieved. Last year, in the run-in to this process, concerns were raised about cumulative development between communities, worries about the priority attached to protecting key landscapes and the need for clarity for the renewables industry. And I think when you look at what's left in these documents, the handling of the issues relating to wildland is a bit of a dog's breakfast. It clearly satisfies none of the key stakeholders who've expressed views across the chamber to us. What is the basis now of the identification of wildland? What's its status? How is it meant to guide decisions on development? None of this is clear. The Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee have made the recommendation that the wildland map doesn't sit on the face of the bill, on the face of the NPF, so that there can be flexibility. The Energy, Economy and Tourism Committee are concerned about the lack of clarity, both for communities and developers. And I think we need to know how these things join up. We need to know the answers. And the Scottish Government urgently needs to take on board the concerns raised by the committees, the consultees, so that everybody has clarity underpinning the decisions which local authorities are expected to make. Now, that's not so that we are all happy or so that everybody agrees, because, as the Minister has commented, that's probably not possible, but we need the clarity so that people know where we are. Take the issue of the 2 or the 2.5 kilometre proposals. Although there's research being carried out, it's not available to us today, and the outcome of that research will be concluded and will shape the final SPP without the Parliament having the chance to test or question it. And we are particularly concerned from the Labour side about the lack of clarity for community renewables. Then, as was mentioned by Murdo Fraser, there's the issue about the proposed handling of fracking and unconventional gas extraction. It's by no means the first time we've debated these issues, but we still feel far away from a coherent, precautionary and clear approach for communities. Now, the Energy, Economy and Tourism Committee recommendations on clarity for communities about the process to safeguard their capacity to be properly consulted are really important, as are their recommendations on the proper consideration of the social, the health and environmental impact of developments on communities. Again, they comment that expert information established by the Scottish Government should be available before this process concludes, and that there's transparency. And I think those major weaknesses identified by the committee need to be addressed urgently. My final point, Presiding Officer, I didn't expect to spend so much time on process issues in preparing for today's debate, but it's really striking when you look across all the committees. It leaves a challenge for the Planning Minister about how he reports back to Parliament and where scrutiny begins and ends. That's not just important for us doing our job, but it's important for the consultees who rightly expect to know how their comments were actually processed in the end. And I think there's more to be done from the Minister on that today. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Now call on Cameron McCannon. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to contribute to the Local Government Committee's debate on the National Planning Framework 3. Parliamentary scrutiny of the NPF 3 and the Scottish planning policy was the first issue to be considered, particularly the adequacy of the 60-day statutory period. In his evidence, the Minister drew attention to the consultation process, including the...
Put your microphone up, please, Mr McCannon. Put your microphone up.
All right.
Perfect.
Apologies. In his evidence, the Minister drew attention to the consultation process, including the publication of the main issues report, and we accepted that a good deal of work had been done before the draft NPF 3 was published in January. However, I think it is worth noting the evidence of the John Muir Trust, which highlights those significant changes from the main issues report, such as the list of national developments, which I think was revealed in January. The opportunity for scrutiny of such significant changes within the statutory 60-day period is limited, and as such I think it invites suspicion, whatever the Minister says, and cynicism when the Government pulls such a fast one out of the fast changes out of the hat so near the end of the process. I certainly think that is the case over the wild land issue, and whilst I note the Minister's pointed to its inclusion in the SPP, I can't help but feel its inclusion in one but not the other is nonsensical and not at all persuasive, as my colleague Alex Ferguson and others have pointed out. If there is no better reason forthcoming to justify submission, then the Minister should recognise our wild land in the final NPF3, a crucial issue. The other issue, I think, raised about the future scrutiny of whether NPF and Scottish planning policy should remain separate documents or whether there should be one overall planning document. And I welcome now the Minister's innovation in issuing the documents together, and along with many of those who gave evidence, recognise now the benefit. Whilst there are some arguments in favour of one combined plan, I am still to be persuaded of the merits of this, and note the Minister's view that they were addressing two separate, albeit linked issues. Indeed, the contributions on this aspect at committee bring me to some of the broader challenges which face the planning system. I think there is agreement in the fact that one of the main problems that face us now is how we encourage greater engagement with and understanding of our planning system. There was a recurring theme in much of the evidence we received that there was a great deal of discussion from members of the public who didn't understand the complexities of the planning system. I have to say that as a new MSP and someone unfamiliar with planning previously, I often and sometimes literally felt their pain. As the committee report states, the general public often become first interested and then involved with the planning process when a planning decision impacts on their immediate environment. I was therefore pleased that there was some discussion about the language sometimes used when discussing planning. For instance, discussions of NPF3 being the what and the Scottish planning policy being the how had the feeling of almost being abstract. I was grateful for the input of the likes of Petra Biberbash of Planning Aid Scotland, who noticed how esoteric language could be a barrier. I realise that this is a complex issue and we shouldn't oversimplify it, but by the same token we should bear in mind our duty to make planning system accessible, and if that means occasionally translating our discussions into even plainer English, so much the better. The review of strategic plans and local development plans and how they relate to each other is also welcome and central to the public engagement issue. I'm sure others will note the lack of up-to-date local development plans, which is a serious concern. How even when they're in place, confusion about the operation and development has, in my experience, compounded uncertainty and disenchantment with the planning system overall. As I said previously, as the committee report has stated, most people's view of the system is influenced by local developments. Put more simply, they will look at new buildings such as housing in their local area and will want to know how and why it has come to be. And it should be our objective that whether or not they agree with these decisions, they should at least understand and follow the process. In this context, I noted the evidence to the Committee on Housing Targets, which is such an important issue to communities fighting for the Green Belt, particularly in my Lothian region, where the South West Edinburgh, East Edinburgh and Mid Lothian, there's a real threat that it is somewhat under siege. Both Robin Holder and Neil Collar suggested the present system of strategic plans setting general targets led to the delays in setting specific numbers. This opaque nature of the strategic plan targets the real problem for the reasons outlined, of the fact that this vague system of how housing need is calculated makes it difficult for public and the community councils to hold anyone to account for them. We're not lacking in elected politicians in Scotland, and whether it is at the national level in this Parliament or at a local level, I think there needs to be far greater accountability over our housing needs and their assessments. Indeed, if I was a cynical man, I might suggest that the complexity of the present system was a convenient smokescreen for some to avoid taking responsibility for housing targets and slightly undermines public understanding. My committee colleague John Wilson also raised the issue of deviations from the local or strategic plans with the Minister, and I was most interested in the Minister's reply. He stated that where there are material considerations, such as an economic benefit, then it would be possible to depart from the plan. This again is at the core of public understanding of the whole process. If a community contributes to a local plan, works hard to shape it, but then finds it's disregarded at a later stage when an application is then approved and it is contrary to that plan, then this to me has serious implications for their faith in what is, after all, meant to be a plan-led system. And there have been a number of examples of this. Accordingly, I would welcome the Minister to comment further on this point and look forward to the Government responding to all these and other points raised during the process.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate. And I call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Claudia Beamish. 6 minutes or thereby. Mr MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking the clerks of the Local Government Committee and indeed all of the committees for the work they put in producing the committee reports which have been outlined by the conveners in this debate today. Can I welcome the MPF3 document and indeed the SPP document being consulted on at the same time, and I note the 14 national developments which cover the nation from north to south and from east to west, and I think demonstrate a level of ambition on behalf of the Scottish Government. In my own area, not my constituency, but given that the two constituency members affected by it have both spoken as conveners, I hope they won't mind me sticking my oar in, so to speak. The development at Aberdeen Harbour that is proposed within the document, the expansion at Nig Bay, I think offers an exciting opportunity for the city of Aberdeen in terms of the potential to develop a deep water facility and would support the oil and gas sector, also the renewable energy sector and the burgeoning investment in that area, and also the tourism sector by the potential to attract cruise ships to the city of Aberdeen, which currently is prohibited because of the lack of capacity within the current harbour footprint. So I think that development underpins the Scottish Government intention to ensure that planning assists in the driving of economic development, and the harbour proposals would be a significant boost to the economy both in the north east of Scotland and indeed the Scottish economy. Indeed, the other 13 national developments I think all have underpinning them a need to boost economic development both in the communities and regions where they will be located, but I think they will have a national ripple effect, and some of them are in essence national projects, for example the rollout of broadband. I think that consulting on SPP at the same time was the correct approach, and the Minister has outlined that what you had was the where and the how being consulted on at the same time, and it allowed for that linkage to take place and also for the connections that exist between the two documents. Now, I know we took evidence at the Local Government Committee around whether the two documents should be combined. I think the Minister made a good case for keeping them as separate documents, but the linkage that exists between them was highlighted by them being consulted on together. Beyond these documents, though, we did have some discussion at committee around what then lies beyond MPF3 and SPP in terms of the hierarchy of planning, and the point was made numerous times at committee. It was made by the convener in his opening speech about the vital importance of ensuring that local development plans and strategic plans are developed continuously and also are up to date in terms of what is produced, because that is often the gateway, as it were, for local communities, as highlighted by many of the speakers, into the planning system, and ensuring that a local development plan is up to date is key in ensuring that the strategic objectives of NPF3 are delivered upon. And I note when this was raised with Malcolm MacLeod of Heads of Planning Scotland at the committee that he said that they were looking at things such as gateway reviews. We have other local authorities coming in and looking at experience elsewhere and at what particular authorities are doing to see whether that can be improved, and that should be of benefit. And he mentioned that the speed in preparing development plans is key to getting people involved. If things drag out over a long period, people lose interest, it goes off the radar. That point about community involvement in the planning process and keeping communities involved for as long as possible. And I think the committee has planted its concerns on the radar in terms of the effectiveness of local authorities in getting their local development plans in place in the time period, the statutory time period that they have to do so. And I'm sure that will be looked at closely and will probably be returned to at future dates. The issue around how planning is done, and I think the way in which planning has evolved in terms of its delivery was emphasised. We heard about the charrette system when we took evidence at both our sessions. The use of that as a means of involving the wider public. I think often the public involvement in the planning process is essentially through the Community Council, and we've heard evidence at Local Government Committee that community councils are not necessarily always representative of the views of the community. Often they are self-selecting, and often they are full of people who have joined the Community Council to say no to a planning application. That's been evidence that has come before the committee. Not always the case, but often the case. And I think what the charrette system has done is allow the planning process and the involvement in the planning process to be opened up much more widely to a much broader spectrum of the community. Indeed, that was a point highlighted by Petra Bieberbach of Planning Aid Scotland and also by Pam Ewan of TAPLAN, that engagement is the key to this. But I think there is still a mindset issue that exists, and what we need to ensure is that those who are making the decisions around local development plans and planning in general have a much greater understanding of how plans now are about developing a community and developing a sense of community and placemaking, rather than simply throwing up housing without a wider consideration of what goes in with that. And I think if we can get that mindset shift alongside the strategic documents that are being put in place, I think we will see a much stronger planning system as a consequence.
Many thanks. Now call on Claudia Beamish to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to contribute to this debate on both the draft documents for planning as a Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change, and also as a member of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. And I endorse our convener, Rob Gibson's remarks in relation to our committee report. Planning underpins our way forward. As the document set out, Scotland's national spatial planning strategy, and I emphasise that word as the Minister did to us in committee, are of profound significance. But as Sarah Boyack has highlighted, the end of the process has been truncated, and some of the decision-making about what is there and what isn't there is somewhat opaque, in my view. Sustainable development must underpin our planning and indeed our economic direction in Scotland. Thus, I was reassured to hear the Minister, Derek Mackay, stating in evidence to our committee, sustainable development and sustainable economic growth absolutely underpin everything in the document. We believe that we can deliver greater growth while protecting the environment at the same time. It is about balance. Our committee notes the concerns of stakeholders regarding the prominence of sustainable economic growth in the document, and the committee considers that sustainable development as defined by Brundtland and the shared UK principles for sustainable development should underpin the MPF3 and be reflected on the face of the document, and the committee welcomes the Minister's comments clarifying the significance of sustainable development underpinning the document. I would appreciate some comment on this in the Minister's closing remarks. NPF3 connects with all policies, and while I understand the Minister's argument that not all policies can be referenced in this spatial document, policies such as zero waste should be. And the problem is also that is one of time, and which I appreciate is a complexity. But, for instance, the National Planning Framework is not even yet in place. So I'd like to know from the Minister how these issues can be taken into account before there's a review in some years' time. Scottish Government must ensure that funding is also in place, along with partners, to make sure that appropriate development can happen. And renewable heat and district heating projects are key in this instance and are an example of this. Flooding is an issue where this is also essential. And partnerships are key to this. And I would have liked to have seen a bit more about partnership working within the National Planning Framework document itself. I agree with the Rural Affairs Committee, and I quote, sharing concerns with stakeholders in relation to the removal of the statement that the MPF3 will help deliver the package of proposals and policies outlined in the RPP2. The committee recommends that this should be included in the final draft. And I would urge the Minister to consider reinstating this. While I strongly support the mainstreaming of climate change, the context must be clearly stated. In the view of Friends of the Earth, and I quote, SPP does not reflect the urgency of the need to decarbonise throughout the subject sections. The planning system must aim to reduce the need to travel in the first place, promote energy-efficient buildings, and prioritise protection and enhancement of key habitats, both in relation to mitigation and to adaptation. MPF3 is also, of course, of profound significance in setting the strategic development that should take place in Scotland's national developments. I want to say something about concerns that national developments are, in the view of some stakeholders, and I would agree with that, conflicted in the move towards the low-carbon economy. Though the Minister said that balance is there in the totality, I still have a concern about some of the projects in the scheme and how these actually contribute to our low-carbon economy. It is disappointing, as highlighted by our committee, that the National Ecological Network is missing from the national priorities. And in National Planning Framework 2, this was actually an aspirational aim, building on the Central Scotland Green Network. And our committee has stressed this. Biodiversity and access to the countryside must surely be part of the NPF3 and at its heart. As co-convener of the cross-party group for cycling, I am, however, delighted that the National Cycling Framework is there, and this sends a clear message to communities, urban and rural, that cycling matters, and indeed it sends a message to local authorities. I'm also pleased with the emphasis in the document on low-carbon, sustainable, connected places, and I agree with Scottish Wildlife Trust that creating places where people want to live and do business is essential. If this is the case, environmental justice must be at the heart of our national planning framework for the future. And I believe we all have an obligation to ensure that present challenges faced by communities living near unrestored open-cast sites is properly addressed, and that consultation on future regulations ensures that there are no repeats. In relation to fracking, Scottish Labour supports the removal of presumption in favour of coalbed methane extraction in the SSP and acknowledges that this industry could potentially create further challenges in meeting our climate change targets if unconventional gas is extracted as an additional fuel rather than replacing existing carbon energy. We will take care and look at the reports in the future. And also in relation to the distances proposed, Scottish Labour supports the implementation of a 2-kilometre buffer zone between communities and the drilling, and would also like consultation on whether minimum distances should be included for water-protected areas. Finally, planning must set the context for developing places in rural Scotland where people live and where housing is affordable and warm, where there are green spaces to relax in, grow some of our own food, and where supply chains are shorter, and where we can get a mobile signal. So I hope the Minister will consider those final issues for rural housing and planning in his closing remarks. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now Colin Stewart-Stevenson to be followed by Alison McInnes. 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to use my local constituency as a window into this important government proposal. Top of my list must be energy, and the impact of Proposal 3 relates to carbon capture and storage. Peterhead, although it's referred to as bottom on page 51, where else it's Peterhead, can make 3 significant contributions to Scotland and beyond. As an intermediate technology, carbon capture and storage can assist in addressing climate change until we're 100% renewable in all forms of energy. Secondly, carbon capture and storage can create jobs. If we set the pace in carbon dioxide capture from gas consumption, our expertise becomes saleable. More jobs, more well-paid jobs are a result. Finally, pumping the resulting carbonic acid into quasi-derelict oil fields creates value, perhaps similar or greater than the actual cost of investment in carbon capture. Oil will remain a vital chemical feedstock, even as we eliminate it as an energy source. It will remain of very substantial value. 3 harbours in my constituency are mentioned in the National Planning Framework: Peterhead, Fraserburgh and Buckie. They form part of the plan in relation to offshore renewable energy. Each has its own individual but significant opportunities to contribute to the mitigation of climate change, to create jobs, and, through supporting the harbours, the creation of a broader infrastructure that will be of value beyond these issues. Now, I'm going to differ from some previous contributors I think the National Planning Framework, which focuses on projects and practice, and the Scottish Planning Policy, which, yes, focuses on policy, do work to different timelines, and there be dangers in merging them into a single document. The SPP evolves relatively slowly to give planning certainty. The National Planning Framework responds to more short-term issues and opportunities. Now, we mustn't allow them to become disconnected. That would be very dangerous indeed. So when we produce a National Planning Framework, yes, we should revisit the Scottish planning policy to make sure that the alignment is properly there. We should remind ourselves projects have three attributes. They have a beginning, a middle and an end. And the end is the most important part of a project, because that's when you've delivered the benefits. But policies are something that have a beginning and then endure over the long term with no determinate end. So they are rather different things. I very much welcome a relook at separation standards for onshore wind. It's time my local council in Aberdeenshire looked at its standards, which are a little bit different from neighbouring councils, and that creates pressures not only on the council from a planning point of view, but in some of the communities in Aberdeenshire. I welcome the reference to in the document to regeneration in Peterhead and Fraserburgh. That's important. Now, one area I do depart from the document again is the document essentially is anchored on city regions. I'm not a great fan of cities personally, but more fundamentally, if you come to the North East, for example, in cultural matters, the culture of the North East does not live in the city, it lives in rural areas and filters reluctantly into the city. In fact, let's look at broadband. That's a similar area where we can create advantage for rural areas where there is as yet a great deal of unrealised potential. But the current plans for broadband may deliver less than we hope. Investment is planned to go where line speed is under 2 megabits per second. But actually, line speed really doesn't matter. You can build a railway line that's 100-mile-an-hour speed limit on it. If you put too many trains on it, they can only run at 20 miles an hour. And the same is true in broadband. It's the throughput on lines that actually matters. I've got over 2 meg at home, but I rarely cross 250 kilobits. In fact, my terminal here in the Parliament is 250 times faster than my terminal at home, and yet my line at home is not on the schedule for upgrade. And I think that's a matter that we should look at. Page 39 in the NPF makes the point. Now, finally, the NPF says that regional transport partnerships have a crucial role. We need to have good connections across Scotland. That is certainly true. And in the North East, my local regional transport partnership, Nestrans, which Alison McInnes used to be a very effective chair of, if I recall correctly, is worth keeping. But on the rest of them, I have to say, at best, I would say not proven. And I think it's time we had a look at what they really contribute. The Chamber of Commerce in Aberdeen says that it commends the Scottish Government for its ambition to use the planning system to drive economic growth across Scotland. Others will welcome this document. I very much welcome this wide-ranging debate. I look forward to the final form of NPF when it arrives in due course. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call on Alison McInnes to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I add my thanks to the 4 committees for the commentary they've provided on their scrutiny of the National Planning Framework 3 draft document. The framework lays the foundations upon which we can protect and enhance the quality of our natural and built environment, and it is an opportunity to highlight key national priorities and define how planning can contribute to securing sustainable economic growth, and it informs private and public investment decisions. In my own North East region, the draft framework recognises a number of projects of national importance that will foster growth and boost both local and national economies. For example, the Dundee waterfront development has the potential to be truly transformational. Similarly, carbon capture and storage at Peterhead would be a world first for a gas-fired power station and cement Scotland and indeed the UK's place as a leader in that technology. If built, this refurbishment would capture more than 85% of the site's CO2 emissions, 1 million tonnes per year. It would deliver clean electricity to more than 500,000 homes, and it would contribute to meeting our emissions targets while retaining fossil fuels as part of a diversity of low-carbon energy sources. And with the UK Government providing up to £1 billion in support, we are making real progress towards establishing this new industry, creating thousands of green jobs and heralding a new sustainable future for engineering in the North Sea. Presiding Officer, when I talk to residents and companies across the North East, businesses that operate locally and those with global reach, their message is always clear and consistent. The North East needs and deserves better infrastructure, and they invariably agree that we've not got our fair share in recent years. Since 2005, the Scottish Government has spent £2 billion on completing road and rail projects across the country. Just 0.5% of this has been spent in the North East. And yet this region is the powerhouse of Scotland's economy. And key to sustaining the North East position as a dynamic regional economy of national importance is delivering on high-quality transport links. Nestrans, Aberdeenshire, Aberdeen City, ACCEF and Aberdeen Grampian Chamber and Commerce all agree on that and indeed submitted representations as evidence during this process. I think the SNP government has so far failed to realise that. The oil and gas sector employs 45,000 people in the North East, but activity in the region also supports many of the 400,000 jobs elsewhere around the UK. Supply chain businesses export billions of pounds worth of goods to countries around the world. And the region must be able to continue to attract the talent and investment that in terms of GVA per person put it second only to central London in the UK. And that is why I would like to use the remaining time I have to highlight why the draft framework must be amended to designate improvements to the East Coast Main Line between Edinburgh and Aberdeen as a national priority. While the framework acknowledges the contribution that the international airport in Aberdeen and indeed the harbour can make to improving connectivity with the rest of the UK and international markets, it is silent on the need to bring our rail services into the 21st century. And that will become all the more important as HS2 will leave the region more peripheral. It's all the more surprising, therefore, that the only rail project of national significance in this draft planning framework 3 is as yet a completely uncosted and unproven high-speed line between Edinburgh and Glasgow. Passenger growth on many North East journeys has far outstripped the Scottish average, but this appetite hasn't been reflected in the quality and range of services, and our rail options pale in comparison to those available in the Central Belt. Indeed.
Minister Mackay.
Appreciate the way in which Alison McInnes is raising the issue and is arguing passionately for our area. But does the member not recognise running the risk between having a debate on general rail infrastructure and the national planning framework, which has very specific functions and may not be relevant to the pitch you're making right now? And that is why there is a difference between that which is identified and that which the member is seeking for.
I hear what the Minister says, and I also hear what the Minister said in his introduction when he said this document was a spatial expression of the Government's economic strategy. Well, I think it's an odd economic strategy that's blind to the needs of this very dynamic region. There's still a section of single track on the line to Aberdeen. Meanwhile, you're talking about putting £750 million, well, you've already put £750 million into improving services between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And in the absence of a business case and details of the likely exceptional costs, it strikes me as premature at best to prioritise a fifth line between those two over tackling the Victorian intercity journey times. It would be of real national significance to ensure that those living and working in the North East have modern, fast rail connections to our capital cities of Edinburgh and London. The framework acknowledges that over the next 2 decades, the projected 35% growth in the number of households in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire is amongst the highest in the country. However, neither the scale or implication of such growth are highlighted or addressed. And that's not my words, but that's those of Nestrans, of Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, of Aberdeenshire Council and Aberdeen City Council in the written evidence to the committees. In order to stimulate and nurture further economic success and facilitate this burgeoning population, transport links must better support the region, and Scottish Liberal Democrats therefore believe that improving the main line to Aberdeen is worthy of national development status. The title of this document is Ambition, Opportunity and Place. Well, we must ensure that we're ambitious for all of Scotland, not just the Central Belt, and I urge Ministers to amend the framework accordingly and ensure that the North East is also a connected place. Thank you.
Many thanks. I would just say the debate is unusual for its lack of interventions, apart from the Minister most recently, and there's a very modest amount of time available for interventions, should members wish to make them or take them. But it is a modest amount. I now call on Stuart McMillan to be followed by Alex Rowe.
Thank you very much for that, Presiding Officer. Certainly, as a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, I am pleased to be taking part in this debate. I also welcome the NPF3 and SPP documents and also the debate that's actually taking place. I aim to focus my comments on the role of planning and the public's engagement with it, as well as briefly covering the role of the planning authorities. Certainly, as we know, planning is an important subject, and it's one that actually cannot be dismissed lightly. And planning creates the foundation for Scotland's future. It provides us with an outline of how our country actually can develop. It can promote certain types of development which we may deem to be necessary in terms of our economy, whilst also acting as a limit or barrier to unwelcome developments which can impact upon our communities. And I certainly can't stress enough that planning actually is a driver for economic growth, sustainability and also jobs. And certainly, as we know, Scotland already has the highest level of economic output per head in the UK, excluding London and the South East. So the planning process and this NPF3 and SPP, these documents, should, and I believe, will actually build upon this. Paragraph 24 of the Local Government Committee's report, I think, sums this up when it says that planning is one of the clearest examples of where the often opaque and impersonal process of making difficult decisions for the needs of society at large comes face to face with people's everyday, individual and family lives in the places where they live. So I don't think anyone can actually disagree or say that planning is boring and it's got nothing at all to do with them. Now, one of the key issues to make is that the public are engaged and realise that they actually do have a role in planning. Now, too often the public feel that planning is something which does happen to them, it doesn't happen with them, and they actually don't get involved in the system, and they really have got no ownership in the system. And while developers have the ability to turn to planning experts for guidance, the public in general don't really have that, don't have those resources, the time or even the knowledge of how to engage with the planning system. And the issue was addressed within our report, certainly paragraphs 105 to 108, and we looked at the various options for engaging with the public. And this would involve having to strip away the jargon and communicating in easily understandable terms. Now, one suggestion was to introduce planning as part of the school education system, for instance in geography. Another example was that of the charrettes and even the Charrette Plus model developed by Planning Aid Scotland. Now, this builds on the traditional charrette process and its ability to empower people by placing them firmly at the centre of the decision-making process about development plans for their community, certainly the community in which they live in. Now, this is certainly something that the Scottish Government should be looking at, and it's one of the issues that we highlighted in the report. Now, the Scottish Government should seek to assess the effectiveness of the various public engagement models with a view to developing a more coordinated strategy across all the public and private stakeholders, and that's something we touched upon in paragraph 113. Now, whilst on the subject of the consultation, there was a concern about the 60-day limit for parliamentary committees to review NPF3. The Local Government and Regeneration Committee concluded in a report that we would encourage the Scottish Government to be mindful of the fact that multiple committees of this Parliament may wish to scrutinise the draft NPF3, and this should be factored into the planning in terms of the timescales for the development of future NPFs. Now, however, there was much praise for the approach of the Scottish Government in the development of NPF3 and how this has actually set a benchmark in terms of consultation. The response from Heads of Planning Scotland was that this has been a real step forward, and this is certainly something to be welcomed, and I am sure it certainly will be developed further for future consultations. Now, turning to the role of the local planning authorities, any successful planning system relies on every part of that system to fulfil its role. The delivery of an effective national planning system requires all levels to participate and operate in a supportive and complementary fashion. And this means that while the Scottish Government can draw up the NPF3 and the Scottish planning policy, there is still a responsibility in planning authorities to draw up their local development plans and their strategic development plans. And the committee was concerned that nearly a decade since the Parliament enacted legislative reform of the planning system, a number of planning authorities in Scotland are currently in violation of their statutory duty to have an updated local development plan. So how can the public actually have confidence in the planning system when some of the planning authorities are failing to engage fully with their commitments? Yes.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Mr McMillan for giving way. Does Mr McMillan agree that the fact that certain authorities don't have up-to-date local plans often leads to planning by appeal, which is something that frustrates members of the public more than anything else?
Stuart McMillan.
Thank Kevin Stewart for that contribution. But I absolutely, I do agree, and certainly that was some of the evidence that we have heard, not just obviously going through this particular piece of work, but certainly going through other pieces of work that the Local Government Committee have been undertaking over the last year or so. I think also still looking at the role of the planning authorities, it's also worth examining actually the issue of the finance. The Scottish Government increased planning fees by 20%. However, the Royal Town Planning Institute expressed concern that these fees are not actually being invested in the planning service. Another witness also supported this position, claiming that there were huge variations between local authorities in terms of how they fund their planning functions, but also that the concern is that simply increasing planning fees might mean more money to local authorities, but no particular requirement for that to link in with improvements into the planning service. Now, despite this, other evidence to the committee said that the increase was not only welcome, but was being invested in the planning authorities. The evidence from Heads of Planning Scotland also revealed that work is being undertaken to measure the cost in the planning system in terms of contributing to the ongoing debate on how the level of fees within the system supports the planning functions of local authorities. And the report recommends that HOPS and COSLA, along with the Scottish Government, should seek to extend the approach across all 32 local authorities, as this could provide a valuable tool in assessing any future increase in planning fees required to adequately resource the system. That was paragraph 134. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, there is far more detail in our committee's report, as well as other committees' reports, that certainly that anyone could actually cover in 6 minutes or so. But I aim to highlight just a few of the points on the issue, and I hope that in doing so, we can actually open up the discussion further on planning to allow others to contribute to the debate. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now Colin Alex Rowley, to be followed by Graham Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The general principles as set out in the NPF3 is something that I very much support. To take the longer-term view of putting in place the infrastructure and the resources to deliver a healthy and vibrant economy that can meet the economic and social needs of Scotland is something I think that we would all sign up to. It is also crucial that communities across Scotland can and do play their part in shaping the future strategic direction of development and prioritising the areas for investment and development at the local level. And that's why the full community engagement in the follow-up through, which in my constituency would be CES Plan and the 5-Plan Local Development Plan, is absolutely crucial. I would also say that I very much support the city-region agenda and recognise that the city can drive the wider economy. But for this to work, there must be wider infrastructure investment across the whole region. I would suggest that in the case of Fife, and I do want to focus on Fife, there is a failure to recognise the need for investment in transport infrastructure. The policy document highlights the potential for major development in what it calls the Fife Energy Corridor that stretches from Methil to Longannet. But I would have to say that without the investment in transport infrastructure, I am not sure that that potential will be achieved. There is a need for a major upgrade of the A92 in and around Glenrothes, better linking up with the north of Fife and beyond, the Red House roundabout upgrade at Kirkcaldy, the Leavenmouth rail link and the direct rail link into the Scythe docks. These are all strategic projects that need to be recognised as key drivers within the Fife economy and I believe should be identified as such. I would also make the point that, as a supporter of the city-region agenda, I recognise that it might not always be possible for everyone to have a job on their doorstep. But if you don't have the transport infrastructure and the public transport in place, then people do not have the means to get to the jobs and therefore will be left behind. Hobbeath Park and Ride is another example. In my constituency, the newly built and opened Hobbeath Park and Choose, where the only choice is the bus. The railway line to and from Edinburgh runs alongside the massive car park, but there is no halt and no option of getting on the passing trains. I have today, Presiding Officer, tabled a motion in the Parliament which I hope can get cross-party support, calling on the Scottish Government to bring forward proposals for working in partnership with Network Rail and Fife Council to build on the successful Park and Ride project and to put in place a rail halt and rail station at this site. It will be good for the Fife and Scottish economies and good for the people of Fife in terms of accessing a wider labour market and should be seen as a strategic priority for Fife. I would also make reference to the framework where it talks about land-based renewables and states that local community ownership and small-scale generation can have a lasting impact on rural Scotland as an alternative source of income. It goes on to say, collectively, the potential benefits of community energy projects are nationally significant. I would agree with that, and I would draw the Parliament's attention to Fife Council, who are currently bringing forward over £11 million of investment in wind generation projects that will see the profits from these projects go back into the Council and therefore into the communities of Fife. I believe that we should be doing more and be more ambitious and should put in place more support not just for councils but for local communities to develop their own community energy projects with the profits going back into local resources and local facilities. Compared to much of Europe, Scotland is way behind when it comes to community ownership of renewables and green energy. In the last 20 months, Fife Council has made great progress. I hope that we can see the Scottish Government do more to support this approach. Why should it be that it is the private profiteers that reap all the benefits in this area of development? I also want to touch on open-cast coal mines, as I have two large open-cast sites in my constituency at Kelty and Crossgates, both of which saw the owners and operators go bust, and leaving a real threat to the restoration proposals and potential environmental disasters surrounding those communities. The NPF3 states poor attention to restoration obligations has left a legacy of open-cast coal sites in South Lanarkshire, East Ayrshire, Fife and elsewhere requiring intervention to ensure that they are properly restored. In my constituency, I also have Westfield, which sits in that category. It is absolutely crucial that we do learn the lessons and key lessons that have come from the failures over the last year, and that we must put in place an insurance policy and a level of bond that will cover all the costs of restoration. And indeed, as the sites are worked, there must also be clear policy on progressive restoration that is properly scrutinised by the Planning Authority. Finally, there is a big question about who pays for the infrastructure to make large housing developments happen. It's not just the road, the water, the drainage. It is also the new schools, the new community facilities, the NHS medical centres and much, much more that comes with major housing infrastructure developments. I'm not sure that the Government have bottomed that out, and much more work, I believe, needs to be done and should be looked at as we move forward with this document, which I certainly welcome.
Many thanks. I call Graham Day to be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to focus my contribution in some of the areas of NPF3 that the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee scrutinised. In his evidence to the committee, Environment Minister Paul Wheelhouse spoke of seeing Scotland as having a living landscape, one that can be considered in the round for all the potential it provides through sound management that is in sympathy with nature. I don't think any reasonable person would disagree with that viewpoint. Scotland's land has been put to work and utilised for many hundreds of years. The landscape we take pride in has in many instances been shaped by man. Continue to do this in an environmentally responsible manner in pursuit of sustainable economic growth is surely to be supported, therefore. Presiding Officer, in focusing on the work of the RACCE Committee in relation to NPF3, I want to begin by dealing with the issue of wind farm siting around towns and villages. In the context of energy policy, particularly wind energy, Planning Minister Derek Mackay was clear that a great deal of effort and attention had gone into the revised SPP and NPF3 to deliver greater clarity and guidance. That is welcome, but I think he would accept more as needed, because even amongst those of us who are supportive of onshore wind developments, there is a recognition that the system we are working within is not without its flaws. There is, for example, unhappiness amongst people that I represent over the 20-metre neighbour notification distance, and there's confusion over what is and isn't a settlement in terms of separation distance, and a sense at times of unfairness that a developer whose application is rejected by the local authority can appeal the decision to a government reporter, but no such right of appeal exists for local people when, say, their council grants planning consent. Although I noted that the Minister pointed out that roughly 2/3 of such appeals are actually rejected. Mr Mackay was clear at committee that the government would not consider a third-party right of appeal, as was suggested by one written evidence provider. And I think we would all recognise that the introduction of such might be fraught with difficulty, at least in terms of defining a legitimate third party, when all too often wind farm proposals attract the attention of self-appointed anti-wind energy groups who have no genuine local locus in the development at issue. But I was pleased to hear that the Minister does recognise that there are genuine issues to be addressed and that there is work going on to ensure there is better engagement at the start of the process, both in pre-application consultation and in the creation of development plans in areas of search. I agree with him that rather than have the public become objectors and appellants at the end of the process, we should encourage them to engage better at the outset, and that we should be front-loading the planning system in engagement terms. And I welcome the rolling out of good practice guidance being worked up between SNH and developers on what developers could and should do to make others aware of developments in their areas. Can I say, Presiding Officer, I also look forward to hearing the outcome of consideration of whether it might be better to have clear definitions of what constitutes a wind farm and a settlement, along with action to ensure local development plans are more up-to-date than is in the case with just over a third of these presently, because of the further clarity, welcome clarity this would provide. Moving on, SEPA in evidence to the committee felt the framework could go further and require that a carbon assessment should be conducted for all developments. And Scottish Environment Link suggested there might be a requirement placed on local authorities when considering applications for major developments to take into account both the carbon impact of the development and how it will help Scotland realise our carbon reduction targets. The Minister pointed out that there is already a requirement for detailed assessments to be undertaken in relation to major developments, and that local development plans presently are required to outline how they will support low-carbon living. However, if we are to complete the journey towards genuine low-carbon living, we surely need to be absolutely explicit in this. And as the committee's report makes clear, we believe carbon assessments should be required for all developments. There needs to be a clear message sent to developers and those charged with policing them that every step we take from here on in must be taken with thought for the impact we have on our environment. If we are serious about bringing the behavioural and cultural change across society that's needed to achieve the targets laid out in the Climate Change Scotland Act and RPP2, then we must take the opportunity that the NPF3 and SSP presents to send out a message. In relation to flooding, the committee is suggesting that NPF3 might be strengthened also to make clear that housing or other forms of development should at all times avoid flood risk areas. That perhaps seems an obvious point, and Scotland is by no means as exposed currently in this regard as other countries are. However, I do wonder if we should not just be looking at the areas we know currently to be at risk of flooding, but given the direction of travel as regards increased flooding incidents and their occurrence in areas which traditionally did not suffer, at least to the extent they have lately, that we need to be one step ahead of the game and anticipating where in 10, 20, 30 years, courtesy of climate change, the existing problems may have spread to. Even if we do as a country, a society, succeed in seriously reducing our emissions, we are still liable to have continuing climate change consequences in the short to medium term. We must be prepared for that. And with the flood risk and detailed hazard maps, we have the basis for that preparedness. The Environment Minister, in evidence to the RACC Committee, pointed out that draft planning policy has been revised to reflect flood risk and that flood risk is noted as a national issue in NPF3. And Mr Mackay reassured us that flood risk, water attenuation and waste would be considered in any planning decisions on drainage and infrastructure. But I do think we need to be crystal clear with the planning authorities that it isn't just about what we know or think we know, but what we might reasonably anticipate and if developments are to be sanctioned on land which might, given the trajectory we're on, reasonably be expected to become susceptible to some degree of flooding, then surely we must at least be demanding drainage provision which caters for that possibility and the prospect of the problem potentially worsening. Presiding Officer, it is in the nature of a process such as this that we challenge the rationale for what is or isn't in the document, or was in the original draft and isn't now, and to hold the government to account. That's how it should be. But across the stakeholders we took evidence from, there was near unanimity on the view that the draft NPF 3 is an improvement on NPF 2 and that the tone and the language is positive and ambitious. Presiding Officer, I hope my contribution has just been a taster of the report that the RACCA committee has produced into NPF 3, and I've been interested to hear of the reports produced by other committees. I look forward to the Minister's response to the various points that have been raised, both today and going forward. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Michael McMahon to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Since the introduction of the first National Planning Framework, we've had both prolonged periods of economic and population growth, followed by economic downswings, which has created investment uncertainty. This emphasises for me the need for the planning system to have a high degree of strategic capability in order to create the flexibility to deal with change and to implement strategic initiatives such as the Ravenscraig Regeneration programme, which, although not within my constituency, will have a huge beneficial impact on my area if it can be developed properly and achieve the positive outcomes we all hope for it. It's not an easy task to strike the right balance between stimulating investment and promoting appropriate schemes, so we require a highly effective and efficient planning system to both stimulate investment and build business confidence. That's why we have to get it right in relation to issues such as land supply, transport infrastructure, water supply and energy generation, amongst others. Unfortunately, because of the unexplained changes from the main issue report, I simply don't know whether NPF 3 is the robust outline of where we need to be in the longer term in indicating where priorities should lie and in relation to setting the scene for major developments. I have therefore a few concerns which I would like to explore and would appreciate clarification from the Minister on. First of all, the previous NPF 3 main issues report of April 2013 stated that, in addition to our nationally important most scenic landscapes, we also want to continue our strong protection of our wildest landscapes. But for some reason, there is now no mention of the core area of wildland map. Now I share with the John Muir Trust the concerns in this regard and would welcome an explanation from the Minister as to why this should be the case.
Minister.
Can I thank Michael McMahon for giving me the opportunity to clarify? I intend to put whatever our final conclusions are as they relate to wildland in SPP, not in NPF 3, but of course there's linkage, but it's more appropriate in SPP, the National Planning Framework, and that's where I intend to home that particular section of planning policy.
Michael McMahon.
I thank the Minister for that clarification, but we often have that discussion in this place in relation to whether something should be on the face of the bill or in guidance. So I am in no doubt whatsoever that the John Muir Trust is right to ask for a sentence to be added to section 4.4 of the NPF that recognises our nationally important and scenic landscapes and recognises the need for vigorous protection of our wildest landscapes. I don't get to the top of Scotland's mountains any longer, as I once did, but I still love visiting our wee bits of hill and glen, and make no secret of the pain I feel at the despoiling and desecration of some of our finest scenery by the erection of wind turbines across swathes of our countryside. Sure.
Rob Gibson.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. As the member with 14 of the 40 wildland areas in my constituency, many of my people wish to know what future they have if there is going to be further restriction. And whilst we are interested in the way that people in the cities like to visit their wee bit hill and glen, we like to live there, and I wonder if you would give us some support.
Michael McMahon.
I think the balance has to be struck, and I'm not convinced that the balance has been struck right. I accept that wind farms have a part to play in our present and future energy production capacity, but I'm far from convinced that the right balance is being struck between our development and the protection of our wildlands. I certainly do not agree with Scottish Renewables that NPF 3 presents a significant risk and could create a barrier to the economic and environmental benefits that renewables could bring to Scotland. If anything, the trend towards the defilement of too many landscapes will continue virtually unchecked if more protections are not included in NPF 3. As the Mountaineering Council of Scotland states in relation to the badly cited wind farms, it's deeply disturbing that the renewables lobby is using all its influence to push the Scottish Government into abandoning proposals that would give some protection to one of Scotland's greatest natural assets. So if the Mountaineering Council is wrong, it wouldn't take much for the Scottish Government to insert the protection being asked for by the John Muir Trust to dispel those concerns. I also have a query about Section 518 of the framework. This relates to the recognition that rail freight networks are to become increasingly important. Now, I don't expect the Minister to comment on the specific proposals currently before planners at North Lanarkshire Council, but I would appreciate confirmation from the Minister that Moss End Railhead has been identified in NPF 3 as a location which will play an important role in achieving fulfilment of Scotland's potential export growth. So can the Minister outline what level of discussion has taken place between Transport Scotland and the owners of Moss End Railhead in recognising the role that the facility can play in the enhancement of the rail freight network identified in NPF 3? And finally, I mentioned earlier the importance of Ravenscraig to the regeneration of central Lanarkshire, and welcome the fact that the project has been reinstated as a national development, having initially been downgraded to one of only regional significance. The concerns have been raised by North Lanarkshire Council about the change in description of the development, in particular the removal of the reference to a new town centre. Now, they've argued that reference to a town centre should be reinstated. They have never been fully convinced that Ravenscraig could be a town centre in the sense that our traditional settled communities would recognise. But if NPF 3 has altered the status of the development, it would be helpful if a Minister could offer an explanation as to why this has happened. Sure.
Minister.
It hasn't in any way changed the status of the development. It's actually been upgraded into national development status. I hope that reassures you in the short time that I had.
Michael McMahon.
Yep, thanks very much. But I knew it had been upgraded to national importance, but the phrase town centre has a significance in terms of attracting investment. It has implications in terms of the local structure plan, and that's why North Lanarkshire Council made that submission to the consultation. And again, as I said, the purpose of my speech was to get clarification. So if something could be put back in NPF 3 which clarifies that for the Council, I think we would all benefit from that. So as I said earlier, I can't completely be content with NPF 3 without those clarifications on the points that I've raised, although the Minister has attempted to answer them. I notice he didn't try to intervene in terms of Moss End Railhead, but I'll leave that to your closing speech, Minister, and maybe you can give me the clarification that we need on that. Only then will I be reassured that the document is as robust as we would all like and need it to be. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I now call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Alison Johnston.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to speak in this debate in which I have a committee interest as a substitute member of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, and I have participated in several of the evidence sessions on this topic, and I also have a regional interest as a South of Scotland member. I welcome NPF 3, and in particular, I welcome its ambition to respect, enhance and make responsible use of our natural and cultural assets. Today, I would particularly like to look at that in the context of coal bed methane and unconventional gas. I welcome Section 4, paragraph 12 of NPF 3, which states that the exploitation of coal bed methane will require careful planning to avoid negative environmental and community impact. And I fully endorse the proposal to create a buffer zone between unconventional onshore gas extraction and communities. In fact, I went further than some others on the committee in supporting a buffer zone of at least 2 kilometres, as proposed by Alison Johnson MSP. Like the rest of the committee, I welcome the Minister's commitment to consider whether the application processes for unconventional gas extraction and hydraulic fracturing fully involve communities. The committee, for this reason, recommended that the final SPP provides fuller guidance to planning authorities on this matter, and particularly to take on the environmental and social impact that these developments can have in communities. My interest in this matter is, as I said, a regional one. The village of Cannonbay in Dumfriesshire has been extremely badly served by the current planning system. which has allowed, under delegated powers, full permission to Dart Energy, working with Buccleuch Estates, to drill for coal bed methane at 19 separate sites around their village. I have here a timeline of the controversy around the coal bed methane drilling at Canonby, provided to me by the newly formed Residents Association. It runs to 4 closely typed pages, which I won't have time to go through now, but I think that says something about the complexity of the issue and the difficulties for local communities to find out exactly what's going on, quite literally under their feet. When the first planning consents were granted to unconventional sites in Canonby in 2007-2008, nobody knew what fracking or coal bed methane was. And until 2013, the Community Council at Canonby continued to believe that permission had only been given for exploratory activity. In fact, full permissions had been granted. Yes?
Thank the member for taking a brief intervention. Just would the member agree with me that it is definitely time, if not overdue, that the National Planning Framework and the SPP should actually show communities where the regulation is and what the process is, and that's the clarity that we're now looking for.
Joan McAlpine.
Yes, I would agree, and in fact I think the committee recommendations, certainly the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee recommendations on this particular issue asked for more clarity, because I think that was the problem. At that time there just wasn't any clarity and people didn't know they didn't know the significance of the developments, and they didn't know how to intervene and get information. So full permission had actually been granted, and in 2010-11, car licences were granted for the introduction of fracking fluids to groundwater. The community even now have been unable to obtain answers as to whether fracking ever took place in their village. And as it turns out, details of hazardous chemical components used in fracking fluids do not require to be disclosed as part of the planning process, something which in my view is morally wrong. And that's why I welcome any improvement that introduces transparency and more community involvement. And that's why I also welcome the Environment Minister Paul Wheelhouse's comments to the Rural Affairs Committee, which have already been referred to by my colleague Graham Day. On 19th February this year, Mr Wheelhouse said, "We in Scotland see ourselves as having an approach to unconventional gas that is distinct from that of the UK. The UK is entitled to take the position it has, but we in Scotland need to ensure that appropriate safeguards are in place should any opportunity to arise, so that unconventional gas is robustly regulated." At the same meeting, the present Minister, Derek Mackay, said that it would be up to the local authority to set the appropriate buffer zone. And I hope he understands that the way planning was handled in Dumfries and Galloway by the local authority does not give my constituents in Canonby a great deal of confidence that the local authority would necessarily be the best authority to set a buffer zone in future. And that's why I supported Ms Johnson's amendment to set buffer zones at 2 kilometres. I would also like to say that SEPA does not come out well either when the Canonby experience is studied. In August 2012, a paper was submitted to the Water and Land Policy and Regulatory Support Group of SEPA identifying poor borehole construction at Canonby. The report stated that 4 wells in Canonby were constructed with no cement casing between 100 metres and 400 metres below ground, potentially allowing saline waters to travel up and contaminate aquifers. But despite this report, no action was taken in respect to the breach of licence. The information only came to light when Canonby Residents Against Coal Developments got the result of an FOI this month, and you may have read about it on Sunday in the Sunday Herald newspaper. Why, if SEPA was aware of these faulty boreholes since 2012, was the public not informed? And why, despite this, were planning consents renewed for 3 years by Dumfries and Galloway Council in April 2013? I don't expect the Minister will have answers to these questions today, but I raise them just as an illustration of the need for greater transparency in the planning process, and that's why I would welcome his response to the recommendations of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee on that aspect of unconventional gas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call Alison Johnston to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the ambition of the MPF3 and there's much I can support. It's good to have a national spatial plan and I'm pleased there's a focus on low-carbon places, as heat networks, energy storage, low-carbon, high-density housing and transforming the way we travel will be key to achieving low-carbon ambitions, and the MPF should help deliver these. One of the big tensions the consultation revealed was over energy priorities. And in the Economy and Energy Committee, we focused on these: renewables, wildland and unconventional gas developments. On unconventional gas, I'm extremely concerned we see this industry as an opportunity without due regard to the risk. It is clear unconventional gas in the UK is not going to lower energy prices like it has done in the US. There's less land and ownership rights are different. Lord Stern, the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee in Westminster, even Lord Brown of Quadrilla Resources came to the same conclusion, that shale gas won't have a material impact on gas prices. I'm pleased the Minister understands that there are risks and confirmed to us in committee that there must be a buffer zone between developments and communities. I proposed a buffer of at least 2 kilometres, which gained MSP support and is in line with Friends of the Earth Scotland's proposals. While a buffer zone can help protect communities from the worst localised impacts, it will do nothing to mitigate against the climate change impacts. Today is the start of a public local inquiry on the UK's most advanced unconventional gas project, the Dart Energy Project in Airth. Now, I'm not going to say anything to prejudice the outcome there, but I am concerned that we're considering consents before the government's independent expert panel has reported and before the government has set the buffer zone. This is surely the wrong way round. Yes.
Minister.
Of course, without any reference to any live planning application, as you would expect. But to follow on from Joan McAlpin's point, as well as Alison Johnston's point, I just want to say that, do you not think it's important that the Scottish Government, by not pursuing the financial incentives that UK government's pursuing in relation to extraction of unconventional gas, in terms of the planning protection, the environmental mitigation, and also taking the time to get the buffer zone right is the right thing to do in any planning application? Environmental mitigation must be done and must be assessed no matter what.
Alison Johnston.
I appreciate the Minister's response, but I think it would have been more appropriate for an inquiry to take place after this information was confirmed. When we have a definitive position on a buffer zone, I think that would be more appropriate. On renewables and wildland, Presiding Officer, this is a difficult tension to resolve. I'm not in favour of increasing the separation distance to a blanket 2.5 kilometres, and I think it's important to look at proposals case by case, because what's the right separation in one site will differ in another. The planning system is good at being flexible like this, but it must get better at listening to and reacting to community concerns. The Planning Democracy briefing for today has some good suggestions I strongly urge the Minister to consider. Energy companies made clear their concerns that use of the wild land map would constrain the development of onshore renewable energy. I think we do need to protect our wildest landscapes from inappropriate development. I don't understand, for example, why hill tracks, which can scar landscapes, don't require planning permission. And I think it would be appropriate for the MPF to refer to protecting the wildest land to make it clear those characteristics can be considered when determining big developments. But I do not support the SNH map creating a blanket assumption against turbine development. Wildland is not always biodiverse, a point that RSPB make in their briefing, and we know mountain habitats are at dire risk from climate change. The best way to protect biodiverse habitats is to decarbonise. The most effective way to resolve tensions here is to maintain public support for renewables, as colleagues have mentioned. There is good support at the moment, but if benefits from a renewables revolution aren't shared equitably between communities and public and private interests, then that goodwill will disappear. Community and public ownership is the best way to build and maintain public support. Presiding Officer, energy companies and the government should be looking to develop large-scale community and public ownership models to ensure these benefits really are shared. The RSPB highlight the importance of the MPF and the SPP when it comes to meeting our climate change targets. And the fact that the MPF contains several proposals that would increase climate change emissions. And I therefore endorse their request that the government clarify how these will not result in increased emissions. And I'd be grateful if the Minister would address this point later this afternoon. And I recognise Sarah Boyack's comments on bringing things together. Will the RPP have to address the added emissions caused in the MPF? Presiding Officer, if we want to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, it is time to move to a truly low-carbon economy. We already have more than enough unburnable fossil fuels. I am surprised that a government who introduced such rightly challenging climate change targets have not yet ruled out unconventional gas extraction, and I would urge them to do so. I concur with Raki's recommendation that the period for parliamentary scrutiny be extended to 90 days, and I welcome their view that sustainable development should underpin the MPF3. Thank you.
Many thanks. Before I call a final speaker in the open debate, can I remind all members who participated in the debate that they should be back in the chamber for closing speeches if they have left the chamber. I now call Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate. When the Parliament debated the draft framework last year, I was delighted to note the removal of any possibility of a coal-fired power station being built at Hunterston and my constituency of Cunningham North. Having had the privilege of serving as Cunningham North's MSP for 7 years now, I can fully attest to the strong feelings that still exist in parts of my constituency about this matter. Indeed, members will recall that the planning application Ayrshire Power Limited put forward for the development of a coal-fired power station at Hunterston received some 21,000 objections, more than any other planning application has generated in Scottish planning history. For my part, I submitted a detailed objection to APL's application and was proud to stand alongside local groups, environmentalists and other interested constituents throughout the long, hard campaign against APL's application. Ultimately, APL was forced to bow to the unprecedented level of public opposition to its application, and I'm pleased to note that the Scottish Government also listened to these concerns. For this reason, one of the most welcome aspects of NPF3 for both myself and many of my constituents is the removal of any prospect of a coal-fired power station at Hunterston. Naturally, I recognise that the Scottish Government did not take its decision solely on the basis of public opposition. Indeed, to have allowed a coal-fired power station to go forward at Hunterston would also have been contrary to some of the Scottish Government's most important stated objectives. One of these, of course, is continuing to make headway in reducing Scotland's carbon emissions. Scotland's adjusted carbon emissions have fallen by 25.7% since 1990, and we are over halfway to achieving our target of reducing those emissions by 42% by 2020. Clearly, the construction of a new coal-fired power station would have been a massive leap in the wrong direction in this regard. What's more is that NPF3 includes a number of aspects that should be welcomed as positive steps forward in meeting Scotland's climate change targets, such as promotion of active travel. It was just last week that this Parliament debated issues pertaining to Scotland's air quality, and I welcome the fact that the Scottish Government has now committed itself to increasing investment in active travel by 50% between 2012-13 and 2014-15, which of course has the potential to reduce Scotland's reliance on less environmentally friendly forms of travel, thus reducing carbon emissions in the process, as well as promoting improved health through increased exercise. Happy to.
Alison Jones.
Is the member aware that after the years he mentioned, the Government intends to reduce investment in active travel? And does the Minister agree with me that the Government could invest far more than the 1% of the transport budget that is currently invested in active travel?
Kenneth Gibson.
I do think that active travel has to be further encouraged, and certainly I would support any acts to increase investment in this particular area. I note that the Minister for Environment and Climate Change has welcomed NPF3's having the potential to facilitate, and I quote, continued movement towards active travel. And this potential is evidenced by the priority given to the National Long-Distance Cycling and Walking Network, which was included in the third National Planning Framework as a national development. Route 753 of the National Cycle Network from Gourock to Ardrossan, with up to 15 kilometres new traffic free and road route, and up to 10 kilometres of new traffic free route around Fairley are both welcome, as is Route 73, the Ann Coastal Path, including Brodick to Corrie, with 9 kilometres of new traffic-free route. All of these benefit my constituents. Thus, I warmly welcome NPF3. It is a solid framework that will not only promote regeneration and development throughout Scotland, but one that will do so in a more environmentally conscious manner than we have seen previously. However, whilst welcoming NPF3 on the whole, I have received a number of constructive concerns from constituents that I would now like to put forward to the Scottish Government on their behalf. I mentioned the inclusion of the National Long Distance Cycling and Walking Network as a national development, and I've been contacted by Fairley Community Trust in my constituency with regard to this aspect of NPF3. The Community Trust advised me they've contacted Transport Minister Keith Brown regarding the possibility of redirecting the cycling route from what they see as the dangerous and narrow pavements alongside the A78 in Fairley down towards the shore. In particular, I understand they'd be interested to hear about the possibility of funding made available for this rerouting, and we welcome any input ministers could offer in this regard. Specific concerns were also raised by constituents unclear about the status of the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan. Thus, I would be grateful if ministers could update Parliament with regard to the status of the NRIP and how it helped inform the third National Planning Framework. I would also add that although my constituents and I, as already mentioned, are delighted about the removal of any possibility of a coal-fired power station at Hunterston from NPF3, we are also keen for this location to be considered as a site for the development of renewables, perhaps taking advantage of the uniquely deep water at the port there. Page 27 of the proposed framework does touch on this, highlighting Hunterston's excellent location, good transport connections, links to Irvine's life science enterprise area, and points out that both manufacturing and service support for offshore renewable energy developments could be successfully delivered at Hunterston, which has important strategic value and, of course, important strategic grid connections that will be developed, including, of course, the link from Carradale in Kintyre and indeed to Connaught Quay in Wales. Thus, would ministers please indicate further as to what the Scottish Government has done since the draft framework was published to look into opportunities for further renewables development at Hunterston, which I know ministers will appreciate, would be warmly welcomed in my constituency, particularly in terms of opportunities for long-term employment. Lastly, I have been contacted by a number of constituents who have taken a very keen interest in the development of the third National Planning Framework, who felt that the timescale for consultation and scrutiny of the draft NPF3 was too short and perhaps even a bit rushed in their view. And of course, we heard even in opening speeches from Maureen Watt and following up by Sarah Boyack, comments on this issue, and we have had through the debate. These constituents have raised concerns that given the tremendous importance of the third National Planning Framework in potentially setting the course of our country's development in the years and decades to come, more time could have been allocated for consultation in order to ensure that we arrive at an optimal product, so to speak. Overall, I am pleased with the third National Planning Framework's contents. I look forward to further engagement with both my constituents and the Scottish Government as we look to follow through and deliver the potential ordered by the NPF3 to promote regeneration development in North Ayrshire and indeed across Scotland.
Many thanks, and that now brings us to the closing speeches, and I call on Alex Johnston. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I first take the opportunity, as many have done during this debate, to congratulate and thank the work of all the committees and the clerking teams who have contributed towards this process. While the debate itself has been an interesting one and thrown up a number of talking points, it has to be said that the sum total of work which has been done and is contained within these reports is impossible to do justice to it during the course of this debate. In fact, I was reminded when we began the debate of an incident that happened to me during an earlier process of the National Planning Framework some years ago, when I was contacted first by letter and subsequently engaged in correspondence by a gentleman from the Edinburgh area who put the proposition that nothing that happens outside the Central Belt could ever be of any national importance to Scotland. Needless to say, I disagreed with him, and I was delighted to hear a number of people during the course of this debate take the opportunity to press for their own local or regional priorities. However, I feel a certain amount of sympathy for Alison McInnes, who was the only one who was actually rebuked by the Minister for her attempt to put forward her own views. Well, I agree with Alison. I take the view that there are many things going on in the North East that are of great importance. She mentioned the Dundee waterfront project, for example, and she talked about the East Coast Main Line railway to Aberdeen from Edinburgh, which all could do with being considered. But she also, of course, spoke at some length about the carbon capture project up at Peterhead, which, of course, has a major potential to forward many of the objectives that this government and this Parliament share. It is worthy of note, however, that that £1 billion worth of support from the UK Government could all be at risk if the Minister was to get his way and the 18th of September was to be remembered as the day when we decided to vote for independence. I suspect that it may actually be remembered as the day on which the great disappointment began. However, on the theme of representing the interests of Aberdeen and the North East, there are a couple of things that have to be covered in that area. And one of the things that I would pay some tribute to the Minister for having included in the planning framework is the need for new housing. We all know, of course, that waiting lists testify to it, but the fact is that the MP3 document contains no specific housing projects with national development status. In fact, we don't even have a definition of what would constitute a national development status in terms of housing. So we are now at the point where the Scottish Government are not even talking a good job on housing, in my opinion. Allow me to go on and develop my point. To put that into perspective, we've already heard about the importance of the North East to the economy of Scotland as a whole. But it has to be said that a recent survey covering the year of 2013 showed that over 40% of businesses in the North East of Scotland considered the availability of suitable housing stock as having a negative impact on attracting new people to the North East. This leaves just 1 business in 10 holding the view that availability of housing stock is having a positive impact on their business growth aspirations. So, if we are to understand and acknowledge the potential of Aberdeen and the North East to act as an economic driver for the whole of Scotland, we should, at the very least, be looking at it as a national priority to ensure that those who cannot buy into the North East's overheated housing market have the opportunity to find themselves accommodation in that environment. Yes, briefly.
Mark MacDonald.
I thank the member for giving way. He will be aware, however, of huge planning developments underway for significant housing in Aberdeen, particularly in my constituency. And does he not accept that one of the factors that has caused the delay in development of many of these things was the fact that Aberdeen for so long went without an up-to-date local development plan?
Alex Johnson.
I admit that there are a number of issues, but that these can be overcome by a government which is determined to achieve its objective. However, moving forward, I would also have to draw attention to the inclusion of Aberdeen Harbour as a national development. The harbour plays a vital role in driving the success of the North East economy. Last year it generated around £500 million for the regional economy and supported 11,000 full-time equivalent jobs. And it handled 5.14 million tonnes of cargo. The fact is, however, that more must be done to secure and improve the infrastructure that leads to and from the harbour, and in this regard, I know many in the North East remain disappointed that this has yet to materialise. Moving on to other subjects, there has been a great deal said during the course of the debate on the subject of wind farms. And of course, the impact that they have on wild land is something that we have all been lobbied on, and we need to express our concerns. However, during the course of this debate, we heard some interesting concepts. Graham Day, I think, he can correct me if I'm wrong, seemed to suggest that those who oppose wind farms, by virtue of their opposition, lose the right to object. Now, I don't understand how that works, although I have to admit that he also said some very important things about flood risk, which I do think we need to address. We've also had some discussion on the subject of unconventional gas. And there's a great deal that was said that was positive, but yet I don't think enough is being done to exploit this opportunity. Joan McAlpin, I'm afraid I'm coming towards the end of my remarks. Joan McAlpin said that she would like to see the industry robustly regulated, and I agree with that principle. I think it's vital that we do have a well-regulated industry. But if robustly regulated means inappropriately delayed, then I think that is not the way we should go. I think, yes, there needs to be more work, there needs to be more understanding, but there needs to be more progress towards an outcome which will deliver a successful and environmentally properly regulated unconventional gas industry in Scotland. After all, I've talked at some length about the economic drivers of the North East and what has been achieved. it has to be pointed out that the oil and gas industry, which has brought that economic advantage to the North East, is something that could be extended to other regions of Scotland if we do so using the expertise and the technology developed in the North Sea, which can deliver an effective hydrocarbon industry to the large parts of Scotland, using the opportunities that we already have to ensure that we are economically and environmentally protected by this valuable resource.
I'm afraid you need to close now.
I'll do what I'm told then.
Many thanks. I call on Sarah Boyack, up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a really interesting debate this afternoon, and I think it strikes me that we've almost been conducting a series of debates under the title of the National Planning Framework and Scottish Planning Policy, because we've been having a debate about the process of the national level of planning, what policy should be contained, what projects should be contained there and how we should get to the conclusions on it. We've been having a debate about those projects, but there's also been a parallel discussion about the principles of town planning and the role and the extent to which town plans are up to date, and to what extent they should guide planning and to what extent communities should be involved. So it's actually been a much more wide-ranging debate, even than I would have expected on the National Planning Framework, which in itself is enough for a debate in itself. I certainly want to agree with Alec Johnson, and I do put this on record because it's a very unusual statement I've just made. I do agree that we should thank all of those for giving us the material and the comments and the background consideration that we've had from the range of committees today and all the witnesses we've had. I think it has definitely strengthened the nature of our debate, but I think it has posed a series of major challenges to the Minister in how we actually conclude this debate and the extent to which we have parliamentary scrutiny and transparency in the process. And I think for me, the concluding part of this process needs to be transparent. Several colleagues talked about this problem when we're dealing with the balance in planning decisions at the local level. People lose track of what happened next. People lose track of why the final conclusion was reached. And I think I would be keen for the Minister in his concluding remarks to tell us what the nature of the feedback will be to each of the committees and how he will actually take us to that point. Will he set out in writing following today's debate, once he's had the time to reflect on not just our discussions, but the wealth of recommendations from all the various committees who have been constructive in their criticism and who have been very robust, I think, in trying to come up with solutions for how we get from where we are now to a sensible set of conclusions. I think the discussion we've had on the project has been important, but before I go to that, I just want to reflect on a couple of the points made by the Royal Town Planning Institute. They comment that at the high level, the NPF and the SPP need to be both influential and integrative, and I think that's a very sensible and a wise comment. They also talk about the need for NPF3 and the SPP to be corporate documents which influence other key documents produced by the government, such as the National Marine Plan, the Infrastructure Investment Plan, the Land Use Strategy, and then the RPP and the Zero Waste Strategy. And that was reflected by several of the speeches made this afternoon. I think Claudia Beamish's comments about zero waste and RPP, I think Rob Gibson mentioned RPP, I think they were absolutely right. It has to come back to what's in NPF 3 and the SPP, because the climate change challenge, if it's going to be successfully addressed, if the government's targets are going to be met in the medium to long term, this document is actually key to actually delivering that. I thought the RTPI submission was also very sensible in terms of their suggestions about the process of approving the NPF and SPP for the future to be better organised so that it's much more of an ongoing process with more engagement, so that the parliamentary process that colleagues across the chamber have just been through is made more effective and is made more transparent. I think that echoes the recommendations from the committees. I think the process which has informed our consideration today needs to be improved for the future. I want to move on to the process of transparency and accountability, because I think the comments made by members across the chamber really illustrate the extent to which planning is, on one level, hugely political but on another level isn't strictly party political, and people have brought a range of interesting comments to the debate today. I think members made very good pleas for investment in their regions. I think the things I particularly picked out, I know Alison McInnes was told off and she was told this isn't the railways debate, but if we are thinking about long-term climate challenge, then our railways and the future development of our railways have to be key, not just in terms of passenger railways, but the freight side as well. And when you look at the detail that was in the Economy Enterprise Committee and the Infrastructure and Investment Committee, there was a lot on those issues. I'll take a brief comment because I've got an extra minute.
Minister.
Just to make the point I was trying to make, there's a specific legislative and consultative process when it comes to rail investment that isn't necessarily the place here in National Planning Framework. I think that's the point I was trying to make.
Sarah Boyack.
But on the other hand, it would be utterly remiss of our colleagues if they didn't take the platform of a debate in Parliament to talk about rail investment in Fife, the comments by Alec Rowley about Rosyth, about Leavenmouth, about the Holbeath Park and Ride, the comments I think Maureen Watt made about freight in the North East, and the comments that were made by Alison McInnes. I think rail freight is absolutely crucial, and rail is absolutely crucial to delivering long-term sustainability and successful economic growth in Scotland. The two have to absolutely go together. I'm not going to repeat the comments I made about energy and the policy framework and getting NPF3 right. I just observe that given that this is one of the big-ticket issues for the Scottish Government, I find it astonishing that there is so much that is still not yet pinned down, whether it's issues to do with significant pump storage developments, fracking and unconventional gas developments, wind. These debates are absolutely crucial to Scotland's economic and to our sustainable future, and they have to be pinned down. And this series of documents are where we have to actually get it right. So, I don't envy the Minister, but I do say that that's his job, is to come up with the right framework so that people know at the local planning level what is expected of them, so that the industry knows where they are given effectively, if not a green light, where they are encouraged to go, where they are not encouraged to go, and where they have to be absolutely spot on in terms of mitigating environmental and landscape impact. And it's important for our communities as well. So energy is one of the key issues that, given that planning is totally devolved, this is something that the Scottish Government needs to get right. In my last couple of seconds, I think I just want to add a comment about the remarks made by Claudia Beamish and Alec Rowley about open cast coal. Environmental justice demands action. It demands that the Scottish Government is clear that when we finalise these documents, everybody knows where that they stand. I think that's been one of the key issues that's come out from today's debate. The comments made by Maureen Watt and Cameron Buchanan, Mark MacDonald, Graham Day, Stuart McMillan about the local plan process, that is a whole other debate. I think it would be worth having about local plans, about the problems of getting local plans up to date, and about the challenge of making sure that housing goes where local authorities want housing to go, and we get that infrastructure development and we get the economic benefit that comes from that. Today, I think, has been really about the National Planning Framework and about the Scottish planning process, Scottish planning policy documents. They have to be our priority in terms of getting them right. And I'm keen to hear, not just in the Minister's winding up speech, but afterwards, how he is going to steer that process, because I think there's so much uncertainty around the Chamber. That is the top priority I think he needs to address in moving this debate forward. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call on Derek Mackay. Minister, you have up to 10 minutes.
Thank you for that generous amount of time, Presiding Officer. Can I start by saying I think we've made great progress on two fronts today. First of all is planning in Scotland, and the second is my relationship with my opposite number in the Labour Party, who said she was only going to ignore the start and the end of the speech, which meant that the body of the speech was fundamentally sound and worth listening to. Which I do think is progress in terms of... well, I do want to get back to planning, but briefly...
Sarah Boyack.
My point was I wasn't ignoring the middle of your speech, and I was actually engaging with the content and the process of the NPF3. I think that's the key thing for all of us today.
Minister.
Thank you for that clarification. Of course, another colleague, Rob Gibson, accused me of being Churchillian in the delivery of planning policy. So in terms of Sarah Boyack's question about is this the end of the process, can I say this is not the end? It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And I think there are fair reflections that have been made, particularly by Sarah Boyack in the time that we have to study the committee reports. I think there is a fair point about the time taken to look at the committee reports and then be able to respond. It would have been somewhat ridiculous if I had come with a government position on every single matter concluded today, having only had a few days' notice of the committee's considerations. So I have fulfilled the obligations of the Scottish Government and what we should have done with MPF3 in terms of the legislative process. I have engaged with the committees as requested, the 4 committee appearances with relevant ministers, shared what information has been required. But I'll certainly consider further how we consult and how we engage further on the final iterations of MPF3 and, crucially, Scottish planning policy, because there was no onus upon me or the Government to bring the policies to the exposure of committee or Parliament, but it was the right thing to do because they are so clearly aligned with MPF3 and Scottish planning policy. And I think it would be fair to respond to each of the committees with their recommendations on how the Government intends to proceed. And in a number of these areas, we didn't take a closed-mind opinion, we didn't railroad through policies. Where we felt further consultation was required, further evidence was required, further expert opinion was required, we've undertaken to do that whilst maintaining the timetable and the participation statement that we outlined at the very start of this process in September 2012. So I will reflect carefully on all the recommendations and the question of process. But it is fundamentally to be welcomed that there is so much consensus around the 14 national developments, around a whole host of policy areas that haven't been controversial, that do represent progress for Scotland. I enjoyed sharing them with my Irish counterpart earlier today, where we discussed issues such as the planning system and the national planning framework, where they want to in Ireland emulate some of the work we've undertaken in Scotland. So it is clear that, of course.
Claudia Beamish.
Is it possible to comment on the absence of the National Ecological Network, which was in MPF 2 specifically, please?
Minister.
Of course, the criteria for what projects of the 242 could be considered for national designation was shared with the committees, and it was felt that the National Ecological Network, whilst valued, whilst important, and we intend to make reference to it, wasn't in itself compliant with all the criteria to become a national designation. We didn't see what value that it added, and it may detract effort from the Central Scotland Green Network as well. So that's not to underplay it, but I think there are other ways we can support it without giving it that national designation status, and we intend to refer to it as we have done in previous iterations of the National Planning Framework. But like with any bid or request for national designation, have all been considered carefully, and we shared quite openly how we arrived at the decisions around those that have continued and those that have not. Some, of course, have not been continued because they are reaching completion or will be complete by the time that National Planning Framework will be in place, which will be in June of 2014, a process undertaken for the last 2 years. But on specifically a number of points Kevin Stewart touched upon, as did the committee, on the relationship between community planning and planning, which is welcome and I think is right. It is about difficult decisions, and we're not avoiding the difficult decisions, but we want them to be evidence-based. We want them to be carefully taken, because these policies are about the legacy for the future, and we have to get those decisions right in terms of environmental impact and sustainable economic growth. And Claudia Beamish asked very helpfully for further clarity around sustainable development and that underpinning the planning system. Yes, it will. And the presumption in favour of sustainable development in Scotland, I think, will give that clarity whilst contributing to the Government's overarching purpose of sustainable economic growth. But of course, with all these policies, there will be planning advice notes and guidance to follow, such as the nature of the planning system, to assist those making the decisions, frontline councillors, planners and other stakeholders, to help make the right decisions, be both well-informed and crystal clear. And a number of members raised the issue about clarity is important, to not fudge issues and leave people with a great deal of doubt on what matters should be considered when planning decisions are taken, and I hope that the final documents do that. But I did feel it was important to gauge members' opinion during this debate and from the committees to inform that work rather than prejudice that work as we reach the final stage of producing the National Plan for Scotland, a spatial expression of the Government's economic strategy and Scottish planning policy in turn. Many members, including Kevin Stewart leading the way, did make comment on the number of local development plans not being up to date. And I think that that's fair criticism, and that's why I've undertaken a planning action plan to ensure that all planning authorities' local development plans are up to date, because it was Cameron Buchanan that made the point, how can you have a plan-led planning system if you don't have credible plans? And therefore the emphasis has to go on to make sure that that's delivered, and that's why I would also welcome, in addition to the proactive planning agenda, the powers through the regulatory reform bill. I will return on the issues of onshore wind and the issues around separation distance and definition and other matters that have been raised by members during this debate. And on unconventional gas, I do believe there are environmental safeguards at the moment, but we will value that expert advice when it comes, and it will inform that debate. And we are not pursuing the financial incentives that exist south of the border. And I'll reflect very carefully on what Joan McAlpine and others have asked for. In terms of core areas of wild land, I hope I've clarified it's a more appropriate place for those references to be in Scottish planning policy, but it does make sense, as Michael McMahon and others have pointed out, to have reference to in the national planning framework, but the body of that work would better feature elsewhere. It's unfortunate that some of the timing of evidence hasn't allowed me to come with a complete view, but I still think it's right to take the evidence first before making a final decision on matters which are incredibly technical. And reflecting on future national planning frameworks improve the process, although I would say again that I've gone beyond that which I was required to do in terms of engagement, community engagement, of course.
Sarah Boyack.
The Minister's helpfully talked about one or two things he will come back to. Could you add the open cast coal mining restoration issue to your to-do list, please, Minister?
Minister.
Of course, we will be assisted by the group, the working group, the task force that's chaired by Fergus Ewing on this as well, in terms of regulation and monitoring, and reflect on planning policy as well. So that is an area that's under consideration with proposed draft policies around there. There are a number of other areas I can't possibly cover in the time that's left, but there will be ongoing monitoring of National Planning Framework 3, the action plan around delivery, further engagement with local communities. In terms of local bids for action, I do believe that this package does touch every part of the country by way of investment and planning support. Just because certain policies don't feature, it doesn't mean that development shouldn't go ahead. And housing is actually an example where our weighting on economic impact and sustainable economic growth should support housing development in the right places. And across the country, I think there will be benefit from infrastructure investment, digital fibre network, grid enhancements, strategic airport enhancements for the Central Belt, the Central Scotland Green Network, and a whole host of other national developments that I think will touch every part of the country. But I want to make sure that every part of the country feels ownership of this document as well, and will reflect on the full geographic nature of the policies. I have said throughout that I think economic impact should have greater weighting in the planning system, and due weighting where that's appropriate, to ensure that we're delivering economic recovery and accelerating that economic growth in a sustainable way, and also creating policies where the language is accessible to the community at large, and it also becomes an investment document for Scotland as well. But I think there's much to be positive about in terms of this debate, the engagement in this debate. Community involvement is important. There's been a great deal of community involvement in this, but we have learned some lessons. So I hope, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, that there's a great deal of confidence in what's been said today, because I think there's a great deal of consensus in the policies and the positions that we've arrived at. And hopefully, when this work is concluded, it will leave us with an ambitious document for Scotland's sustainable economic growth.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on John Wilson to wind up the debate on behalf of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. Up to 7 minutes, Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate this afternoon has shown the value of the Parliament considering and engaging in the planning system in Scotland. This is true not just in terms of the proposed national planning framework we are considering, but also in terms of the wider discussion about planning, such as how does Scottish planning policy guide the planning process, how should the spatial development of Scotland be taken forward, and how do we develop the criteria to decide which types of national development should be included in the framework. I'd like to start by reflecting on the main themes from the Local Government and Regeneration Committee report. As a Parliament, we need to consider the planning policies we have put in place and ask, is the planning system having a significant impact on delivering real progress on economic competitiveness, environmental protection and social justice? Is the planning system delivering on our commitment to sustainable development? Is the planning system ensuring we enable things to happen where they should and prevent them from happening where they should not? From what we have heard this afternoon, I believe the answer to those questions is yes. However, we must not be complacent, and this debate has offered the opportunity for the Government to address some of the shortcomings we have identified in the proposed framework. As a committee, we have highlighted the need for the Parliament to have a greater role in setting out the policies which underpin our planning system. We must also take a greater role in shaping the development of future frameworks before any public consultation gets underway. We welcome the level of public engagement the Government has undertaken on the proposed framework. However, we feel there is a need for a more coordinated approach to informing and engaging the public about the planning system. We hope this is an issue the Government will seek to address. As the convener, Kevin Stewart, of the Local Government Committee said when he opened this debate, planning is one of the most important areas of public policy because it is fundamental to the success of so many other policy areas. However, the convener and others have also pointed out that the planning system is often seen as a complicated and difficult to navigate. This is especially true for ordinary members of the public, who are often ill-equipped and lack information about the planning system. One witness who gave evidence to the Local Government Committee highlighted the fact that his experience, members of community councils often have little knowledge about how the planning process works in Scotland, and yet that's usually the first point of call for local communities. Other witnesses spoke of the confusion of phrases such as green belt can cause in the minds of the public. This highlights the need for a more joined-up approach to be taken to engage ordinary people in the planning system. I am sure the Local Government and Regeneration Committee will return to this issue later this year when we consider the Community Empowerment Bill. I'd now like to turn to the issues raised by other committees and point out this is one of the first debates in this chamber where we've had 4 committee reports put to the chamber at the same time, and I think that has to be welcomed and shows the consideration that was taken by those committees in feeding into this debate. The Economy, Energy and Tourism pointed out to concerns about the lack of clarity in the framework on rules surrounding onshore wind farms and unconventional oil and gas extraction, or fracking as it is now commonly known. Indeed, I was struck by how these concerns reinforce the views of the Local Government Committee for the need to integrate and merge and where of the national planning framework with the how of the Scottish planning policy. Clarity in the planning system is a key factor here. The Economy Committee highlighted the lack of information in the framework on how areas of core wild land may affect economic development. The committee also called on the Government to provide clearer guidance to planning authorities, developers and the public on unconventional oil and gas extraction. When the Parliament considered the second National Planning Framework in 2009, it is safe to say that most people in Scotland had never heard of the term fracking. Yet today it is becoming fast one of the most dominant topics for public discussion in relation to the planning system, as outlined by Joan McAlpine in her contribution today. This demonstrates the need for the planning system to keep pace with modern development, and today's debate provides an opportunity for the Government to ensure the finalised framework, along with the Scottish planning policy, properly reflect these concerns. The Economy Committee also said that in future consultations on issues such as fracking or areas of wild land should be concluded before the Government presents a proposed national planning framework to the Parliament. Again, this view chimes with the Local Government Committee's call for the Parliament to be fully engaged from the start of the process of developing the next framework. Our colleagues on the ICI Committee scrutinised a wider variety of policy areas such as transport, housing, sustainability and digital infrastructure. The ICI Committee highlighted the need to ensure that planning supports Scotland's climate change targets. This is especially true in terms of the future developments of our main airports. Indeed, sustainability is a theme which has featured heavily across the work of all 4 committees. Developments like high-speed rail and seaports are all areas which must be considered carefully in terms of their sustainability and impact on residential areas. On housing supply, the ICI Committee also echoed some of the concerns of the Local Government Committee in terms of the number of local authorities who do not have up-to-date development plans. In a plan-led system, it is vital that local development plans are up to date. Otherwise, we risk undermining the credibility of the planning system. Turning now to your colleagues on the Rural Affairs Committee, who pointed out that the framework will play a fundamental role in reducing Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. However, they highlighted several areas where the framework could be improved. Presiding Officer, this winter, Mother Nature has reminded us all, as if we needed reminding, of the challenges which climate change presents for communities across the country. Nowhere is this more in evidence than in relation to flooding. The Rural Affairs Committee, reinforced by Claudia Beamish and Graham Day, pointed to the need for the framework to align with flood management plans and to ensure that housing and other developments avoid being constructed in flood risk areas. The committee also highlighted the benefits of the carbon calculator tool used in assessing wind farm developments and called for this to be rolled out to all developments across Scotland. The Rural Affairs Committee convener Rob Gibson also stressed the need to restore peat and bogland environments, not just those located in North and North East, but right across Scotland. Presiding Officer, a number of members took the opportunity to make a case for developments in their own constituencies, and that is to be welcomed, and hopefully these members will engage in discussion with government ministers about those developments. And in conclusion, I commend the report of all 4 committees to the Parliament and look forward to the Scottish Government acting on the recommendations contained in these reports, and that the final version of the National Planning Framework and the revised Scottish planning policy take account of those recommendations and we move forward with the planning policies in Scotland that benefit Scotland as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Wilson. That concludes the Local Government and Regeneration Committee's debate on the Scottish Government's 3rd National Planning Framework and review of Scottish planning policy. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 9349 in the name of Liam MacArthur on the reappointment of a member of the Standards Commission for Scotland. I call on Liam MacArthur to move the motion on behalf of the Scottish Parliament corporate body. Mr MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am speaking to the motion in my name as a member of the corporate body to invite members of this Parliament to agree to the reappointment of Matt Smith as a member of the Standards Commission for Scotland. The Commission has 5 part-time members. Its role, as I'm sure colleagues are aware, is to encourage high ethical standards in public life. It does this by promoting and enforcing the codes of conduct for councillors and members of devolved public bodies. In addition to promoting the codes, the Commission receives reports from the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland following his investigation into alleged breaches of the code. If the Commission upholds the Commissioner's findings, then it determines, in accordance with the legislation, the sanction to be applied. Turning to the reappointment process, under the Scottish Parliamentary Commissions and Commissioners etc. Act 2010, members of the Commission are reappointed by the SPCB with the agreement of this Parliament. The SPCB sat as a reappointment panel on 30th January 2014. I chaired the panel and the other members were Linda Fabiani and David Stewart. I thank Tony Swabe for confirming by way of a validation certificate that this nomination is made on merit following a fair and robust reappointment process which conformed to good practice. Details of the information considered by the SPCB and the criteria on which Matt Smith was assessed has been set out in the report lodged by the SPCB in Spice. Matt Smith will, we believe, continue to ensure high ethical standards are upheld in public life, and I am sure that the Parliament will want to thank him for his contribution to date and wish him well in his continued work as a member of the Commission. Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Mr MacArthur. The question on this motion will put a decision time to which we now come. There are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 9355, in the name of Kevin Stewart, on the Scottish Government's third National Planning Framework and review of Scottish planning policy, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9349, in the name of Liam MacArthur, on the reappointment of a member of the Standards Commission for Scotland, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.